My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 71 years old, a retired aerospace structural engineer. To my only son, Julian, I was just a stubborn, mediocre old man, a burden he had to tolerate now that he was entering middle age. He and his new wife, who comes from a wealthy, high society family, clearly shared that point of view. I knew this for a fact because I came home to Seattle a day early from a fly fishing trip in Montana. The moment I walked through the door, I found my wife, Eleanor, sitting all by herself in the sunroom, quietly crying. Meanwhile, from down the hall, in my prized, mahogany-paneled study, I could hear my son laughing out loud. He and his in-laws were sharing a massive laugh, ordering workers to tear down the bookshelves that held decades of my engineering blueprints. They were actively planning to convert the main house into a highly profitable, luxury short-term rental for party crowds, while driving my wife and me out to the backyard, relegating us to the drafty, uninsulated old carriage house above the garage. They thought my life was in its twilight. They thought I was defenseless, someone they could just push around. They had absolutely no clue that the quiet, average old man they were trying to throw away like garbage was secretly a wildly successful investor worth tens of millions of dollars. More than that, they didn't know that a legal trap, one they wouldn't be able to escape, was already being quietly set right under their feet. Before we go any further, if you believe that respecting your elders is a line that should never be crossed, take a moment to root for the ultimate justice that was about to come their way. The flight from Bozeman back to Seattle was incredibly smooth. I purposely didn't call home ahead of time. When you reach 71, you don't get many opportunities left to surprise the love of your life after 48 years together. I kept picturing Eleanor's face, that gentle smile of hers that always took a second to register, but never failed to make my heart skip a beat. I slid my key into the front door lock and turned it softly. The house was quiet. No, it was a strange, unsettling kind of quiet. "Eleanor!" I called out, setting my duffel bag on the oak bench in the entryway. "I'm home, sweetheart." The only real answer I got was a muffled, choked-up sound coming from the end of the hallway. I walked quickly toward it, my good mood instantly vanishing. Eleanor was curled up in the wicker chair in the sunroom, the one we bought together at a flea market back in 1990. Her shoulders were shaking uncontrollably, and that deep, painful sobbing cut right through me. "Eleanor, honey, what's wrong? What happened?" 她猛地两条起来，红肿的双眼里满是两恐。"Arthur, you weren't supposed to be back until tomorrow. I caught an earlier flight. What on earth is going on? Did someone do something to you?" She shook her head furiously, trying to wipe the tears from her face with the back of her hand. They're here, Arthur, in your study." My blood ran cold. Right as she said it, a loud, jarring noise shattered the peace of our century-old home. It was laughter, raucous laughter coming straight from my study. That was my son Julian's voice, but he wasn't alone. I recognized the sharp, distinctly arrogant laugh of his mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling. "Who is in there?" I asked, my stomach knotting up as the answer began to dawn on me. "Julian," Eleanor whispered, looking as though just saying the names out loud might bring bad luck. "And Chloe and her parents. They showed up an hour ago out of nowhere with measuring tools and blueprints. They're tearing things apart." Tearing things apart. Those words made absolutely no sense to me. Leaving Eleanor in the sunroom, I headed down the hallway alone. The laughter grew louder and louder. They sounded so comfortable, so incredibly excited, while my wife was crying just 20 feet away. I stood at the doorway of my own study. The scene before my eyes felt like a total betrayal. Julian, my 40-year-old son, was holding a laser measure, pointing little red dots all over the walls. His wife, Chloe, was rapidly typing notes into an iPad. Her parents, Marcus and Victoria Sterling, were standing right by my antique globe, holding glasses of single malt whiskey they had poured from my personal cabinet. "I'm telling you, Marcus," Victoria said, swirling the ice in her glass, "this whole mahogany wall needs to be knocked out. We should open this space up, put in floor-to-ceiling glass, and turn it into a minimalist entertainment lounge. The tech executives coming into Seattle for conferences absolutely love that aesthetic. Marcus Sterling, a stern-faced commercial real estate mogul who constantly looked like he was smelling something unpleasant, nodded slightly. The bones of the house are good, and the location here in Queen Anne is perfect, but the decor is ancient. Look at these bookshelves. It's a complete waste of space. Simply pathetic. Chloe let out a sharp chuckle. She was a tall woman who always wore sharply tailored designer suits and possessed an equally sharp, biting personality. I know, Dad, it's a total disaster. But once we install top-tier smart home systems, we can easily pull in $2,000 a night for this place, right, Julian? My son, a middle-aged man who should have been mature and grounded, just nodded along repeatedly. His eyes held a greedy, intense look I had never seen in him before. It's a gold mine, honey, an absolute gold mine. Julian, my voice cut through the room like a blade. Julian's hand shook, and the laser measure clattered onto the hardwood floor. His face turned completely pale. Dad? Dad, why are you back early? Wasn't your flight tomorrow? I live here, I said, my voice dangerously calm. A better question is, what are you doing? Why is your mother crying in the sunroom? The Sterlings turned to look at me. There wasn't a hint of surprise in their eyes, let alone shame. They just looked annoyed that their fun had been interrupted. It was the look you'd give an elderly servant who brought the wrong dish to a dinner party. Oh, Arthur, you're back, Victoria said, taking a casual sip of my whiskey. Don't make such a big fuss. Eleanor is just being overly emotional. We're simply planning a restructuring and upgrade of the property assets. My property restructuring? I asked. Chloe stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest. Yes, Dad. We're giving you formal notice. Julian and I are going to fully take over this house. I looked over at Julian. He couldn't even meet my eyes, staring dead at the floor like a kid caught doing something wrong. Take over? Of course, Chloe said, using the tone you'd reserve for someone who lacked basic intelligence. Our penthouse in Bellevue is luxury, but the monthly mortgage is incredibly high. Plus, Julian's latest project requires serious cash flow. This house, well, it's going to be Julian's eventually anyway. We might as well unlock its commercial value right now. Turning the main house into a high-end short-term rental is the most logical business decision. I was speechless. I looked at the bookshelves I had personally sanded and installed with my own hands, and the drafting table in the corner that had seen countless late nights of me drawing up engineering designs. Chloe kept right on going. As for you and Eleanor, you can move your old things into the carriage house above the backyard garage. It's a bit small and doesn't have central air, but it's definitely functional enough. Honestly, at your age, do you really need this much space anyway? This move makes the most financial sense for everyone involved. The carriage house, that damp, freezing space where we only stored the lawnmower and old cardboard boxes during Seattle's rainy winters. They were trying to exile me to the garage attic. I felt the color drain completely from my face. I bought this house using the very first royalties from my engineering patents. I spent most of my life here. This wasn't some piece of furniture they could just use as collateral or a cash cow. Get out. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a heavy, suppressed weight. Chloe actually laughed out loud. Excuse me, what did you say? I said, I raised my voice, pronouncing every single word clearly, get out of my house. Marcus Sterling, who had been silent up until now, took a step forward. He was a man used to giving orders, a man used to looking down on everyone in the business world. Listen, Arthur, stop acting like an unreasonable child. We are family, and we are offering a flawless business solution to your current financial struggles. My struggles? Your age, Victoria chimed in, setting her glass down. And that meager fixed pension of yours. Julian has always been completely honest with us. We know exactly how much pressure he's been under to supplement your living expenses every single month. It felt like a physical punch to the gut. Julian was supplementing me. I had never taken a single dollar from my son, not 1 cent. We think his devotion as a son is admirable, Victoria continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. But it's a heavy burden. Now that he's married to Chloe, we are his family too. We've decided to carry this weight together. We will assume the title and ownership of this property, and we will take care of the taxes and maintenance. In exchange, Marcus added, you and Eleanor get a free place to live in the backyard. It is a highly generous trade. I turned to face my son. He was still staring blankly at the floor, and his complete silence was all the confession I needed. Julian. He flinched at the sound of his name. Look at me. Slowly, his eyes met mine. They were filled with a toxic mix of shame, guilt, and a sickening display of weakness. Your wife is driving your mother out of her own home, I said, anger causing my voice to tremble. These people, whom I never invited here, are drinking my whiskey and carving up my life like vultures over a carcass. Tell them to leave. Julian, tell them right now. This was his final chance. This was the exact moment for my son to finally stand up and be the man I had always hoped he would become. Julian looked at me. Then he looked at Chloe. Then he looked over at her incredibly powerful, wealthy parents. And right then, he completely broke. Dad, just listen to them, he pleaded, his voice thin and desperate. Stop making a scene. You're embarrassing me. Embarrassing him. They're right, Dad, he said rapidly, desperately trying to justify his own betrayal. This house is way too much of a burden for you to handle anyway. Our company's finances have been incredibly tight lately, and we need this property as collateral for a loan. You're not young anymore, and Chloe and I are always worrying about you and Mom. This is the only way forward. The only way forward? I said softly, exiling me to a freezing garage attic. Dad, just stop, he finally snapped, his face flushing a deep, angry red. I've had enough. I'm tired of constantly worrying about this outdated house. I'm tired of paying the price for your ridiculous pride. I'm tired of pretending that we aren't all just waiting around for you to pass away. This house belongs to me now, or it's about to anyway. Chloe and I are making the calls here. Just face reality. In that exact split second, my anger completely vanished. It didn't fade away. It evaporated. In its place came a cold, incredibly sharp clarity. The entire world suddenly looked perfectly defined. I was no longer looking at the boy I had raised with my own hands. I was looking at a 40-year-old stranger, a parasite who had just confirmed my absolute deepest, darkest fears. I saw his wife, Chloe, wearing a smug smile of victory. I saw her parents looking at me with the detached pity of zookeepers observing a failing elderly lion. The son I used to know was gone. I understand, I said. My voice was so smooth and steady it surprised even me. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then I turned my back on them completely. I walked out of the study, passing right by my son, who looked utterly bewildered by my lack of an angry outburst. I walked back into the sunroom. Eleanor was still sitting there, her eyes a mix of fear and desperate hope. Arthur, what happened? I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the hall closet, pulled out her cashmere coat, walked back over, and held it open for her. Put your coat on, Eleanor. What? She sobbed. Arthur, what are you doing? We're leaving, I said. My voice sounded like a strategist who had just surveyed the entire battlefield and pinpointed the enemy's exact vulnerability. Julian and his friends have taken over. Julian and the rest of them had followed me out into the foyer. What are you talking about, Dad? Julian asked, his voice a mix of confusion and irritation. Where are you two going? You can't just walk out. I helped Eleanor to her feet, guiding her arms into her coat. She looked at me with 1,000 questions in her eyes, but she trusted me. For 48 years, she always had. I picked up her purse from the entry table. Then I turned around to face my son one last time. I looked at him, at his wife, and at her parents. You just said you were taking over everything, I said, reaching for the bronze handle of the front door. You said you're making the calls now. I flung the heavy door wide open. Then it's all yours. I helped Eleanor across the porch and out into the biting evening air of a Seattle autumn. I reached back and pulled the door shut behind us. The sharp sound of that lock clicking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. It was the definitive countdown to the total end of one life and the sudden, thunderous beginning of a completely new one. I didn't bother calling a cab. I opened my phone and used a high-end black car service that I had kept on retainer for years. In less than 2 minutes, a spotless black Cadillac Escalade pulled up silently to the curb. Eleanor was shivering beside me, whether from the chill of the night or the sheer shock of it all. She looked at the incredibly expensive luxury vehicle, then back at me, completely lost. Arthur, what are we doing? Where are we going? Somewhere perfectly safe, Eleanor. Get in. The driver, wearing immaculate white gloves, held the door open for her. I gave him the destination, the Fairmont Olympic Hotel downtown. During the entire ride, Eleanor didn't say a single word. She just stared blankly out the window, the passing streetlights catching the tears still glistening on her cheeks. When the car pulled into the grand, century-old entrance of the luxury hotel, she gripped my arm in a panic. Arthur, we can't stay here, she whispered, her voice trembling. A place like this easily costs $1,000 a night. We don't have that kind of money to throw away. It's fine, sweetheart, I said, gently patting her hand. I led her inside to the front desk. The night manager on duty looked up, and his practiced, professional smile instantly turned into a look of deep, genuine reverence the moment he recognized my face. Mr. Pendleton, what an absolute honor. We had no idea you'd be joining us tonight. It was a last-minute decision, James, I said calmly. I'll need the presidential suite immediately. Right away, sir. Please come this way. We'll have your bags brought up instantly. Eleanor gripped the sleeve of my coat with white knuckles. Arthur, Mr. Pendleton, the presidential suite? I squeezed her hand reassuringly. Let's get upstairs first. I promise I'll explain everything. The suite was breathtaking. It was larger than the entire first floor of our old house. Outside the wraparound floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering skyline of downtown Seattle looked like a blanket of diamonds spread out beneath our feet. Eleanor stopped dead in the middle of the living room. She reached out to touch a luxury Italian marble-side table, as if she couldn't believe it was actually real. Arthur, she began, her voice shaking violently, I'm scared. What is going on? How do they even know who you are? I took off my coat and draped it neatly over the back of a chair. I guided her over to a velvet sofa that likely cost more than the 10-year-old Toyota we drove back home. Eleanor, I need you to listen to me. I have to make a phone call right now. It is the most important phone call of our entire lives. I pulled out my phone. My hands were incredibly steady. The anger that had built up inside that house had burned away any trace of hesitation, leaving behind nothing but a cold, rock-solid resolve. I dialed a number I knew completely by heart, a number I hadn't called in over 6 months. The phone rang twice in New York before a voice answered. This is Evelyn Cross. Evelyn, it's Arthur Pendleton. There was a sharp, audible gasp on the other end of the line. Arthur, it's the middle of the night in Seattle, which means it's 3 a.m. for me. What's wrong? Is it... The time has come, Evelyn, I said. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the line. Are you absolutely certain? Evelyn's voice instantly shifted into a sharp, hyper-professional battle mode. You know exactly what this means. Section 9, Clause D is the ultimate nuclear option. Once we activate it, there is absolutely no turning back. It means Julian will lose. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, I said. My tone as flat as if I were discussing the weather. He just showed up with his wife and her predatory in-laws to drive my wife and me out into our own backyard garage attic. He made his choice. Activate the clause immediately. Before the sun comes up tomorrow, I want him completely cut off from everything. Consider it done, Evelyn replied without a moment's hesitation. I'll catch the morning flight to Seattle. I need you and Eleanor at my Columbia Center office at exactly 9 tomorrow morning. My team will work through the night to have all the legal paperwork finalized. We'll be there on time. With that, I hung up. Eleanor was staring at me, her eyes a battlefield of profound fear and total confusion. Section 9, Clause D? Cut who off from what, Arthur? You're terrifying me. Who is Evelyn Cross? I sat down directly across from her. I had kept this secret tightly locked away for 20 long years, entirely to protect her. But looking at her now, I realized that this supposed protection had left her completely defenseless against the wolves. I owed her the truth, a truth that had been delayed for decades. Evelyn Cross, I began slowly, is my attorney. My real attorney, not the neighborhood accountant who files our basic taxes. Evelyn is one of the top trust and estate partners in the country. She manages my entire financial empire. Your financial empire? Eleanor, I said, taking her ice-cold hands in mine. For a very, very long time, I haven't been completely transparent with you. Or with Julian. I laid it all out for her. I told her about the Elite Aerospace Materials Research Center, where I used to work. When I announced my early retirement at 51, I didn't actually just pack up and leave. I had secretly bundled a massive portfolio of revolutionary structural material patents that I owned individually, and I sold them to an international aviation conglomerate. The money I made wasn't just enough for a comfortable retirement, Eleanor, I confessed, the long-held lie tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. It was a staggering fortune that could last for generations. "How much, Arthur?" she asked in a barely audible whisper. The initial patent buyout was $32 million. After federal taxes, I placed $26 million of it into an irrevocable blind trust. I named it the Pendleton Family Trust. Eleanor let out a muffled, choked-up cry, as if the air had been suddenly forced out of her lungs. $26 million? It has been compounding heavily over all these years, sweetheart. Evelyn's team has done an extraordinary job. Today, the total valuation sits right around $52 million. But why? She violently pulled her hands away from mine, breaking down into heavy tears. It was a cry of profound betrayal, not the excitement of sudden wealth. Why would you keep this from me? All those decades of counting pennies, driving that broken-down Toyota, waiting for clothes to go on sale, and Julian. Why did you do this? Because of Julian, I said, the crushing weight of the tragedy finally hitting me. I watched the children of my business partners turn into absolute monsters when handed that kind of money. Wealth made them weak. It made them entitled. It turned them into parasites. I refused to let our son turn into that. I wanted him to understand struggle. I wanted him to know the value of an earned dollar. I wanted him to build a life as a real independent man, not some spoiled trust fund kid drifting through life. So you pretended we were broke? I chose an incredibly grounded way of living, I corrected her gently. I gave him every single tool he ever needed to grow. The trust fund secretly covered his entire tuition at Stanford. The trust fund quietly wired him his very first round of seed capital to start his company. But I always told him it was the absolute last of my dwindling retirement savings. I genuinely, naively believed I was teaching him accountability. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sleeping city below. But I was completely wrong. I didn't teach him accountability. I just hid the target. I let him believe that I was weak, that I was worthless, and that I was nothing more than a pathetic burden. And he believed every single bit of it. Eleanor fell silent. She was desperately trying to process 20 years of lies, trying to blend the husband she had bargained with at flea markets with the multimillionaire standing in this lavish room. "So, our house?" She finally spoke, her voice faint as a ghost. "The house they're measuring right now, the house they're trying to take from us." I turned to face her. "That's the core layout of the entire arrangement, Eleanor. Legally speaking, that house doesn't belong to us at all. It never did." "What do you mean?" I said, feeling the cold spark of retribution ignite in my blood. "The title to that house belongs entirely to the trust fund. We are merely tenants with a lifetime right of residency. And Julian just tried to illegally evict his actual landlord." The next morning, Eleanor and I arrived right on time at Evelyn Cross's penthouse office in the Columbia Center. Eleanor was still in the same clothes from the night before, her eyes red and swollen. I, however, had instructed the hotel concierge at 6 in the morning to deliver a $4,000 Armani charcoal gray suit. When I walked out of the bedroom fully dressed, Eleanor gasped. In 48 years, she had never seen me wear a garment that wasn't bought off a discount rack. She was finally starting to see the true nature of the man she had married decades ago. Evelyn's office was a far cry from the dusty, cheap coffee-smelling corner firms. It occupied an entire floor of the skyscraper. The massive black walnut desks, the seamless glass walls, and the incredibly expensive contemporary abstract art on the walls all radiated an absolute sense of authority. The receptionist didn't even ask for our names. She simply gave a deep bow as we walked through the doors. Mr. Pendleton, Miss Cross is waiting for you in the main boardroom. Eleanor gripped my hand tightly. This real world of mine was entirely foreign to her. We walked into a room featuring a 30-foot-long mahogany conference table. Evelyn was standing at the far end, looking out over the Seattle skyline. She wasn't just a commanding voice on the telephone. Dressed in a sharply tailored, minimalist, cream-colored power suit, she exuded absolute, unquestionable authority. "Good morning, Arthur, Eleanor." Evelyn gestured toward the chairs. "I am deeply sorry about the current situation, but I am very glad you are finally here. We have a massive amount of work to handle, and our time is incredibly tight." "Evelyn, what is actually going on?" Eleanor asked softly. "Arthur told me about the trust, but why would Julian go to such lengths? It can't just be about that house, right?" "No, Eleanor, of course it's not just about the house," Evelyn said grimly. She slid a thick, spiral-bound report across the table toward me. "The moment Arthur mentioned last night that we might need to trigger Section 9, Clause D, I authorized my private investigation team to dig in. What you experienced last night wasn't just a son being disrespectful. It was raw, unadulterated desperation from someone backed into a corner." I flipped open the report. The very first page was a detailed breakdown of my son's financial situation. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. "My goodness," I murmured. "What is it, Arthur?" Eleanor leaned in to look. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. I simply rotated the report so she could see the final number, highlighted in bold text at the bottom of the page. "What? What does $850,000 mean?" she gasped. "That," Evelyn stated coldly, "is the exact amount of personal, unsecured debt your son Julian and his wife Chloe are currently carrying." "That's impossible," Eleanor protested. "Julian's tech startup has a massive valuation. He's a vice president. He told me he makes nearly $300,000 a year." "$300,000 is a very respectable income, Eleanor," Evelyn interrupted. "The problem is that his wife Chloe spends upwards of $600,000 a year." She pressed a button on a remote control, and a massive screen on the wall lit up. It was filled with line after line of financial records: luxury apparel from Fifth Avenue, the incredibly high lease payments on Chloe's Porsche Panamera, and the massive mortgage on their Bellevue penthouse that they couldn't actually afford. "They are living a massive lie, Eleanor," I said, looking at the numbers as the puzzle pieces finally clicked together. A suffocating, completely empty lie driven by vanity. "But what about the Sterlings?" Eleanor pushed further. "Chloe's parents are commercial real estate moguls. They are incredibly wealthy. Surely they would step in to help." "That is the ultimate irony of the situation," Evelyn said, switching to the next slide. "The Sterlings are wealthy on paper, but their actual cash flow is a complete disaster. They value appearance above all else, but they never pay out of pocket. They completely assumed that since Julian was a rising tech star, it was his responsibility to maintain Chloe's lavish lifestyle. To live up to their vain expectations, Julian has been borrowing from one place to pay off another. He has taken out high-interest personal loans and maxed out 27 different credit cards. Simply put, he is about to lose everything." I stared at the records, the bills from ski trips to Aspen, the charges for Cartier jewelry. "That's why they were measuring my study yesterday." My voice turned icy. "They are in desperate need of unlocking the home's equity. They couldn't wait any longer." "The situation is far worse than that, Arthur." Evelyn's voice dropped, and the temperature in the room felt like it plummeted. "What they did yesterday wasn't Plan A. That was merely Plan B." "Plan A?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn looked directly at me. "Arthur, I didn't want to tell you this unless it became absolutely necessary. But 4 months ago, I received a confidential communication from the Director of Private Banking at Morgan Stanley, who manages the Pendleton Trust assets." She clicked open a new document. It was a scanned screenshot of an email. 4 months ago, Julian and his father-in-law, Marcus Sterling, brought in a corrupt lawyer they hired privately and scheduled a high-level, closed-door meeting at the bank. They presented a formal petition to freeze all assets controlled by the trust fund. I bolted upright from my chair. "They did what?" "They attempted to legally declare you, Arthur Pendleton, as suffering from severe Alzheimer's disease, rendering you completely incompetent to handle your own affairs. Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth in horror. 他们准备了厚厚一叠伪造的材料。伊芙琳继续说道，里面详细记录了你是如何记不清事情，如何像个有炖鸡皮的疯老头一样生活在破房子里，甚至提交了一份被吊销执照的黑衣开具的虚假诊断书。他们声称你拒绝享受奢华生活，正是精神严重衰退的铁证。They put together a massive file of falsified documents, Evelyn continued. It went into deep detail about how you supposedly couldn't remember basic things, how you lived like a crazy old hoarder in a broken-down house, and they even submitted a fraudulent diagnosis from a physician whose license had been revoked. They claimed that your choice to live a simple life was absolute proof of severe mental decline. But living simply was our own choice, Eleanor cried out in anger and sorrow. They turned your choice into a weapon to use against you, Evelyn said. They demanded the bank grant Julian immediate emergency signing authority over the trust to protect his father's assets from being squandered. They wanted the $52 million. I felt ice water running through my veins. They wanted to take everything down to the bone, Evelyn confirmed. But the bank director, of course, threw them out like clowns. The architecture of this trust features the highest level of legal protection in the country, specifically designed to guard against this exact kind of betrayal. The director knows you personally, Arthur. He saw right through the incredibly clumsy fraud, and per security protocols, he notified me immediately. I sank heavily back into my chair, completely crushed by the sheer depth of this betrayal. This wasn't just a greedy son wanting a larger house. This was a cold-blooded, long-calculated conspiracy. My son had tried to forcibly place me into an institution, to legally erase my existence as a rational human being, just to openly steal my empire. So yesterday, Eleanor said, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place for her. Yesterday was their plan B. I finished the thought for her. When they realized they couldn't legally seize the millions, they settled for the next best thing. The house, they assumed, was my only real asset. They couldn't get the millions, so they decided to bleed out a $3 to $4 million piece of property. They didn't just want to banish us to the carriage house, Arthur. Eleanor's voice was suddenly as solid as steel. They wanted to completely wipe us out of their lives after draining every single bit of utility we had left. I looked at Evelyn. So he triggered it? Evelyn Cross let out a cold smile. The exact moment he crossed the threshold of that bank 4 months ago, he automatically triggered Section 9. Clause D. Arthur, Julian has already been completely disinherited. He just hasn't found out yet. Eleanor's hands were still shaking, but it was no longer out of fear. It was anger. A pure, freezing fury I had never seen from her in my entire life. They wanted to put you away in an institution, she said, her teeth gritted, her voice dangerously low. They wanted to completely strip you of your basic dignity. They tried, I said, and they failed. So they settled for the next best thing and came after our home. Vultures, she spat. Absolute scavenging vultures. Arthur, what do we do now? What happens next? I looked over at Evelyn. Tell her exactly what Julian just did to himself. Evelyn crossed her hands, looking at Eleanor with a calm, professional respect. Eleanor, when Arthur and I established this trust, today's exact scenario was his absolute greatest fear. He worried that if Julian fell in with the wrong crowd, he might eventually view his father as nothing more than a heartless ATM. Because of that, Arthur had me write a strict, highly punitive defensive clause deep into the core of the trust. We refer to it as Section 9, Clause D. What does it do? Eleanor asked. Privately, we call it the wolf in sheep's clothing clause, Evelyn explained. It explicitly states that if the primary beneficiary, Julian Pendleton, is found guilty of causing any form of intentional financial, emotional, or physical harm to the trust creators, Arthur or Eleanor Pendleton, that beneficiary will be immediately, completely, and permanently disinherited. Eleanor's eyes went wide. Permanently? Permanently. Irrevocably. It acts as if his name was never written on the documents to begin with, Evelyn confirmed. His attempt to legally declare Arthur incompetent 4 months ago already perfectly triggered the clause, and yesterday their hostile attempt to take over your property and exile you to the garage attic was simply the absolute final nail in his coffin. From this very moment forward, Julian Pendleton has no legal claim to a single penny of the $52 million Pendleton Family Trust. The words echoed through the spacious office. $52 million completely gone. Eleanor desperately tried to process the astronomical number. So where does the money go? Who gets the house? It automatically rolls over to the contingent beneficiary, Evelyn said, the individual Arthur designated to inherit all assets unconditionally should Julian ever disqualify himself. I smiled. Maya? Maya? Eleanor's jaw dropped in shock. Your late brother's daughter? Yes, my brother's daughter. I nodded firmly. The girl working as a smoke jumper out in Oregon. The girl who, no matter how exhausted she is, absolutely never misses a Sunday video call to check in on the two of us. The girl who sends you handmade pinecone crafts whenever you're feeling sick. Evelyn nodded along. I contacted Maya early this morning. I gave her a brief outline of the situation. She was incredibly shocked, but she is a highly rational young woman and understands completely. She's catching a flight to Seattle tonight. As of right now, your niece is the sole legal heir to the entire commercial empire, including your historic century-old home in Queen Anne. A heavy silence settled over us. Recognizing the staggering reversal of fate, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. He has absolutely no idea, I whispered. None, Evelyn agreed. He knows absolutely nothing. He genuinely thinks he's dealing with a confused old man living in a broken house who can be easily pushed around. They want the house, I said, a perfect blueprint rapidly forming in my mind. They were so incredibly desperate to destroy our lives just to get their hands on a $3 to $4 million piece of property to use as collateral. I looked at Evelyn, my eyes sharp as a razor. Then let's give them the house. Eleanor was stunned. Arthur, what on earth are you talking about? It's a trap, Eleanor. They set theirs. Now it's time for us to set ours. Evelyn caught on instantly. The top attorney's eyes lit up with the distinct spark of a hunter. Oh, Arthur, that is pure genius. Completely cold-blooded and legally airtight. What exactly do you have in mind? Your family, Eleanor, believes I am old, weak, and suffering from mental decline, I said. They think they won. They think I ran away last night like a stray dog. They are arrogant, greedy, and incredibly foolish. We are going to use that foolishness against them. I turned back to Evelyn. We are going to draft a brand new document, a highly official-looking property transfer and comprehensive guardianship agreement. It needs to look completely seamless, I added. The paperwork must state that we, Arthur and Eleanor, due to our declining mental states, are voluntarily transferring the deed of the home over to them. In exchange, Evelyn chimed in, picking up the thread immediately, Julian and Chloe will assume absolute control over your ongoing livelihood. They will be in such a frantic rush to sign it that their hands will probably shake. But Eleanor, the devil is entirely in the details. The fine print of this agreement will be a flawless work of art. What will it say? Eleanor asked nervously. It will state in plain black and white, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing, that Julian and Chloe, along with their witnesses, Marcus and Victoria Sterling, hereby acknowledge and confirm that Arthur and Eleanor are currently in an extremely vulnerable, legally incompetent state. They will sign a declaration confirming they are intentionally inducing and taking over all assets with full knowledge that their elders are incapable of making autonomous financial decisions. It's not a property transfer agreement, I declared coldly. It's a confession, Evelyn summarized. A notarized, witness-signed confession of a conspiracy to commit fraud and a direct violation of the Vulnerable Adults Protection Act. It is a perfect, self-inflicted legal disaster. My heart began to pump heavily. It was no longer from grief, but from a cold, deeply righteous anger. It's absolutely flawless, I said. They will be so thoroughly blinded by the prize right in front of them that they will willingly sign their own ruin. Do it, Eleanor said without a hint of hesitation, her voice solid as bedrock. I pulled out my phone, my fingers perfectly steady. I dialed Julian's number. The phone didn't even ring twice before he snatched it up. He must have been staring at his screen like a nervous wreck. Dad! Dad, where on earth are you guys? Is Mom okay? We've been worried sick. His voice carried the perfect, practiced concern of a devoted son. It made my stomach turn. I took a long, heavy breath, making sure my voice sounded fragile, exhausted, and completely defeated. Julian, son, Dad, what's going on? Your mother and I are at an attorney's office downtown right now, I said, perfectly playing the part of a completely broken old man. We've been talking all night long. Maybe you're right, son. I heard a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, followed by dead silence. What exactly do you mean, Dad? He asked cautiously, terrified of scaring away the prize that was finally within his grasp. We're old. I let my voice tremble at just the right moment. And Eleanor's mental state is very poor. I just don't have the energy to fight anymore. You said you would look after us. You said you would handle everything. That house, it really is too much of a burden. Oh, Dad, he sighed deeply. The sheer relief and sudden arrogance in his tone was sickening. Yes, of course. We will take care of absolutely everything. You are making the absolute right choice. I promise you. Good, I said weakly. Then I need you to come down to the Columbia Center right now and meet an attorney named Evelyn Cross. I want to officially transfer the property over to you today. Let's just get this whole thing over with. There was a brief pause on the line. I could practically hear the greedy gears grinding away in his head, instantly crushing any last trace of caution. Are you serious? He whispered, his voice dropping. The transfer happens today? Yes, I said, at 2:00. Bring Chloe and bring her parents too. They seem to understand these commercial transactions well. I want everyone there as witnesses to ensure everything is completely legal and official. No problem. Absolutely no problem, Dad. His voice suddenly soared with a triumphant, victorious energy. We'll be there at 2:00 sharp. You don't have to worry about a single thing. From now on, we are going to take very good care of you. I know you will, son. I hung up the phone. I looked over at Eleanor. Her face was pale, but her eyes were iron. I looked at Evelyn, who was already rapidly dictating the specific terms of the agreement to her assistant. The bait is taken, I said. Evelyn offered a slight smile. The trap is set. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors of the massive boardroom were pushed open. My son, Julian, and his wife, Chloe, led the way into the room, followed closely by Marcus and Victoria Sterling. They looked like completely different people compared to the night before. They had clearly gone home, showered, and put on their finest attire, looking as though they were stepping into a grand coronation. Julian wore a sharply tailored navy blue custom suit. I'd bet anything it was charged to a high-interest credit card. Chloe wore a striking, brilliant white Chanel power suit, looking exactly like an arrogant corporate executive who had just closed a massive Wall Street merger. Victoria was dripping in dazzling Van Cleef and Arpels jewelry, her smile sharp and greedy, while Marcus strutted in with his chest out, looking as though he had single-handedly won a magnificent corporate war. Dad, Julian said, striding across the room and dropping a heavy, possessive hand onto my shoulder, I'm so incredibly glad you finally came to your senses. This is truly the best outcome for everybody involved. Chloe, meanwhile, slid toward Eleanor like a serpent. Mom, Eleanor, she said, using a sickening, sugary sweet voice that made my skin crawl. You look absolutely exhausted, you poor thing. But don't worry. From this exact moment on, we are taking over everything. You won't have to lift a single finger. I promise you won't regret this decision. Let's get this paperwork wrapped up quickly, Marcus Sterling bellowed, aggressively claiming the head of the conference table as if he owned the firm. We have a victory dinner reserved at a high-end steakhouse for 7 tonight. Evelyn Cross, maintaining her absolute peak professional composure, elegantly gestured for them to sit down. Thank you all for making the time on such short notice. As Mr. Pendleton already shared with his son, he and Mrs. Pendleton have spent a long night reflecting deeply and have arrived at a major legal decision. She slid 4 thick, beautifully bound legal documents across the smooth mahogany tabletop. This is the property transfer and comprehensive guardianship agreement, Evelyn stated, her voice falling into a completely flat, neutral legal cadence. It is a highly exclusive, all-inclusive arrangement. Chloe's eyes practically glued themselves to the cover page. She was visibly trembling with pure excitement. "Let me summarize the core terms," Evelyn continued. "The agreement dictates that Arthur and Eleanor Pendleton agree to unconditionally transfer the entire deed and ownership of the property located in Queen Anne over to Julian and Chloe Pendleton." Chloe let out a short, sharp sigh of immense relief. "In exchange," Evelyn said, taking her time with the words, "Julian and Chloe agree to assume full, lifelong guardianship over the transfers. This includes, but is not limited to, housing arrangements, medical decision-making power, and absolute financial management." "Yes, absolutely no problem. We completely agree," Chloe blurted out, her hand already darting forward to grab the Mont Blanc pen from the center of the table. 100%. Where do we sign?" Evelyn raised a single hand to stop her. "Patience, Mrs. Pendleton. We must follow legal protocols strictly. There are multiple signature pages." She turned her gaze directly to the Sterlings. "Since Marcus and Victoria were heavily involved in the initial family discussion last night and are personally present today, we would be incredibly grateful if you would sign as the official witnesses to this agreement." "Witnesses? Of course, more than happy to help," Marcus said, puffing out his chest with a smug grin. "Wonderful," Evelyn smiled. "Your signatures belong on page 8. It is a standard witness affidavit. It doesn't just confirm your presence and participation in this agreement. It certifies that you are personally verifying the current mental status of the transfers." "Mental status?" The triumphant smile on Victoria's face faltered just a bit. "Yes," Evelyn said, seamlessly flipping open the pages. "Right here. By signing, you are legally confirming and testifying that you have personally observed and unanimously concluded that Arthur and Eleanor Pendleton are currently in an extremely vulnerable state, heavily requiring specialized guardianship. You are testifying that they are transferring their property based solely on the fact that they have lost the autonomous capacity to manage their own affairs." Marcus and Victoria exchanged a quick, knowing look, their sinister smiles returning. They thought this was a stroke of absolute genius. In their minds, this legally locked down the narrative that Arthur was a confused old man with dementia, giving them a double layer of security over the house. "Of course," Marcus nodded repeatedly. "We are more than happy to testify to that. We've been saying this for months now. They've clearly lost their grip on reality and desperately need our supervision." "Perfect," Evelyn said crisply. "Then please, let's begin." She handed the first copy to Chloe. Chloe didn't even glance at a single line of the actual text. She flipped directly to the final page and frantically scrawled her name. Julian followed right behind her. His signature was messy and shaking, betraying a heavy amount of nerves, but he didn't hesitate for a second. They didn't read a single line. They didn't see the specific language admitting that they were knowingly taking advantage of their parents' cognitive decline. They didn't read the fine print holding the trap. They were driven entirely by raw, blinding greed, signing like madmen. Next, Evelyn handed the remaining documents to the Sterlings. Both of them flipped directly to page 8 and proudly signed their names, officially committing perjury regarding our supposed mental incompetence. Finally, Evelyn pushed the last document over to Eleanor and me. I looked at my wife. Her hand was perfectly steady. She picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen and signed her name. Then I signed mine. Evelyn gathered the 4 copies, neatly tapping them against the table to align the edges. "Well," she said quietly, "it appears all formalities have been successfully completed." Chloe bolted upright, her face flushed with triumph. She clapped her hands together loudly. "Absolutely perfect. The deal is done. Julian, honey, we need to call the contractors right now. They can get onto the property and start the demo first thing tomorrow morning." She turned her head, looking down at me with pure condescension. "Dad, Mom, as soon as we get back, we'll help you pack up your things and move them out to the carriage house above the garage. I'm sure you'll find that little studio much more comfortable and cozy." Julian let out a massive breath, looking as though the weight of the entire world, or rather the weight of his $850,000 in debt, had been lifted from his shoulders. I let a heavy, dead silence hang over the room for a few moments. I watched them based in the absolute ecstasy of their perceived victory. I watched the greed, the relief, and the unadulterated arrogance bloom all over their faces. I let them enjoy it for a full 10 seconds. Then I looked over at Evelyn. She gave me a slight nod. Actually, I spoke up, my voice crisp, loud, and cutting through Chloe's non-stop celebration like a blade. We aren't quite finished yet. Chloe's smile instantly froze on her face. What? What do you mean? We already signed the papers. You certainly did, I agreed, nodding. But the document you all just signed contains a very minor logical flaw. A tiny technical detail, really. Marcus Sterling narrowed his eyes, his expression souring into immediate irritation. What detail? I leaned forward, crossing my hands on the table. That house. I don't actually own it. The air was instantly sucked right out of the room. Chloe's triumphant, greedy face completely turned to stone. Marcus Sterling's smug grin, the look of a ruthless real estate tycoon who had just closed a magnificent deal and eliminated his useless in-laws without spilling a drop of blood, began to crack completely. To be perfectly precise, Mrs. Pendleton, you are indeed far from finished. Evelyn Cross spoke up. Her voice had transformed entirely. The polite, accommodating tone from moments before was completely gone. In its place was a sharp, freezing, razor-thin authority. It was the voice of a top-tier litigator who was no longer looking to negotiate, but was ready to hand down a definitive sentence. Chloe, who had been getting ready to walk out, froze in her tracks. What do you mean? We signed the documents. The deal is finalized. What I mean, Evelyn said, leaning her hands flat on the table, is that the property transfer and comprehensive guardianship agreement you all just executed contains a fatal legal defect. Marcus let out an impatient, deeply condescending scoff. What defect? It's a standard asset transfer agreement. I have an entire corporate legal department at my disposal, Attorney Cross. I know these commercial documents far better than you do. Is that so, Mr. Sterling? Evelyn arched an eyebrow. Of course, Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. Before we ever stepped foot in this office, we thoroughly pulled the public property records for King County. That estate in Queen Anne is explicitly registered under Arthur Pendleton's name. He just signed away his rights. The deal is done. We're leaving. Evelyn allowed a smile to spread across her face. It was anything but a warm smile. It was the grin of a hunter watching a pack of wolves step directly into a snare and pulling the trigger. That is precisely your most fundamental, fatal mistake, Mr. Sterling. You reviewed the public property records, but you did not have, and frankly, had absolutely no clearance to view, the highly confidential internal records of the trust fund. You see, Arthur Pendleton's name is indeed printed on that property deed, but his legal capacity is merely that of a trustee, not the owner. The air in the boardroom began to crackle with tension. Julian, who had been basking in relief moments ago, was now looking completely terrified. What? What are you talking about? What trust? The actual legal and completely undisputed owner of that estate, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing like steel, for the past 20 consecutive years has been the Pendleton Family Trust. What trust? Chloe's voice cracked into a sharp, panicked shriek. The Pendleton Family Trust, I spoke up, using a commanding, powerful voice for the first time since they had walked through the door. My trust fund, the one established 20 years ago after I sold my core technological patents. Julian stared at me, his face turning entirely blank as his brain completely stalled out. You have a trust fund? What does that even mean? Like a basic retirement savings account with a few $1,000 in it? No, son. I leaned forward, looking straight into his eyes. It isn't a minor retirement account. It's the kind of money that can buy and sell your entire life. Victoria Sterling let out a short, incredibly grating scoff. A trust fund? Stop trying to play mind games with us. You live in a crumbling old house, and you drive a 10-year-old Toyota. You're just a stubborn, retired engineer. What kind of trust fund could you possibly have? A few $1,000s? This is an absolute waste of our time. I simply stared at Victoria, letting her arrogance and her complete, pathetic miscalculation hang heavily in the air. I let her enjoy that final, delusional second of feeling superior. Evelyn, I asked, my voice perfectly calm, what is the exact current valuation of the Pendleton Family Trust? Evelyn looked down and opened a brand new folder that none of them had seen before, a deep, crimson, highly confidential dossier. As of the opening bell on Wall Street this morning, Evelyn announced, pronouncing every syllable clearly, the liquid assets and capital holdings under the Pendleton Trust total exactly $52,049,000, and it continues to compound. The dead silence that followed was so absolute that I could clearly hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. I could even hear the trembling breath of Eleanor beside me. Even though she already knew the truth, hearing that astronomical number stated out loud in this room carried the impact of a nuclear blast. Julian just stared at me blankly, his mouth opened, then closed. He couldn't make a single sound. The smug, well-groomed face of Marcus Sterling looked as though it had completely melted in an instant. He looked like a man who had been struck squarely in the face with a sledgehammer. 52 million. But the absolute best reaction, the single image I will savor for the rest of my days, came from Chloe. In a matter of seconds, an incredibly complex sequence of expressions flashed across her face. First came total confusion, followed by absolute disbelief, and finally a sudden explosion of manic, unhinged, all-consuming ecstasy. Her eyes lit up like the neon signs of Las Vegas. 52 million, she gasped, snapping her head toward Julian, her entire voice shaking. Baby, we're rich. She actually burst into a loud laugh, a sound that sat somewhere between a shriek and a sob, completely hysterical. He has $52 million. Oh my God, Julian, we're going to be incredibly wealthy. She lunged like an octopus at Julian, who was still completely paralyzed, locking her arms around his neck. We're rich. Screw that old house. Who cares about a broken-down wooden house? We are going to inherit the entire trust. She violently pushed Julian aside and spun around to face me. Her entire personality shifted in a fraction of a second. The biting sarcasm was gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate, incredibly sycophantic flattery. Dad. Oh, Dad. I mean, Arthur, I knew it. I always knew you were an extraordinary man. I always told Julian, your father has so much dignity, so much profound wisdom. Shut up. My voice was a block of solid ice. It instantly cut through her hysterical, brown-nosed flattery, leaving her words completely stuck in her throat. What? The fake smile on her face began to crumble. You aren't rich, I said, staring her down, and neither is he. You get absolutely nothing. She froze. What do you mean? Julian is your only son. He's the sole heir. He used to be, I said. But this agreement, Chloe stammered, pointing wildly at the documents on the table like a broke gambler clinging to a useless losing ticket. We already signed it. This is a legally binding contract. Ah, yes. Evelyn walked over and picked up the stack of documents they had been in such a frantic rush to sign. She held them up high. The property transfer and comprehensive guardianship agreement. I must express the firm's deepest gratitude to all of you. This is a truly priceless legal document. Chloe looked at her father, completely confused. Look, she said it's priceless. It is indeed incredibly valuable, Evelyn agreed with a nod, though her eyes were dead cold. But it is completely worthless as a property deed. As I stated, since Arthur does not own the home, the transfer clauses are completely void. No, the true value of this document is that it is an airtight, ironclad confession. Marcus Sterling's face instantly drained from pale to a ghostly gray. Having spent decades navigating the ruthless business world, he finally understood. A confession, Julian murmured, his voice incredibly faint. Yes, I said, looking directly at my son. You, your wife, and your in-laws just signed a legally binding document in front of witnesses. In it, you explicitly stated that you unanimously concluded I am mentally incompetent, and that with full knowledge of that diagnosis, you conspired to strip away my control over my assets. I bolted upright from my chair, slamming my hands flat on the table, forcing them to look at me. You just hand-delivered a perfect piece of criminal evidence for fraud and the exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Evidence that can easily put every single one of you behind bars. Julian stared at the documents, then at me, and finally at Evelyn. Every single drop of color left his face, replaced by an ugly dark red flush born of absolute desperation. "So what?" he suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, slamming his hand heavily onto the mahogany table. The massive noise made Chloe flinch back, and Eleanor shivered. "So what? That's just a pile of useless paper. This is a stupid word game you're playing. It doesn't prove a damn thing." He stared at me like a cornered animal, his eyes bloodshot, his voice cracking and shrill with pure panic. "You can't do this to me. I am your son. I am your only flesh and blood in this world. I am the rightful heir to that trust. That $50 million belongs to me. You can't just make it disappear into thin air." He whipped his head toward his father-in-law, grasping at any straw he could find. "He can't do this, right, Marcus? Tell them. This isn't legal." Even though he was looking around the room, he was begging his wife and his in-laws, desperately trying to reassure them, trying to hypnotize himself. "This is my birthright. You were the sole heir, Julian," I said. My bizarre calmness seemed to terrify him far more than any scream ever could. "You were the sole heir up until exactly 4 months ago, specifically Tuesday, May 14th, at 10:15 in the morning." Julian went completely rigid. I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't?" I countered. "May 14th, a closed-door boardroom at the Morgan Stanley Private Banking Headquarters. You, your father-in-law Marcus, and that highly paid corrupt attorney he hired. Does that ring a bell?" Julian's face sagged like a corpse. He looked like he had just taken a bullet to the chest. How could you possibly know about that?" His lips trembled. The bank promised it was a strictly confidential inquiry." "They called me the exact second your foot stepped out of the building," Evelyn interjected, her voice cutting like frost. "As the chief administrator of the Pendleton Trust, I hold a strict fiduciary duty to thoroughly investigate any malicious inquiry or illegal attempt to seize trust assets." "A malicious inquiry?" Julian stammered, desperately searching for some weak defense. I was just asking questions. I was worried about his health, about his mental state." "You weren't asking questions, Julian." I walked around the massive conference table, stopping right in front of him. I felt incredibly tall, filled with absolute authority. "You went there to accuse me. You declared to a board of banking executives that I was completely senile. You claimed I was a hoarder. You even absurdly used the quiet, private life your parents chose as evidence that my brain was severely deteriorating and posing a threat to the fortune. You brought a cutthroat lawyer, demanding the bank strip away my human rights and hand the keys to that $52 million directly to you. And that specific action," Evelyn declared, "was a fatal tactical blunder, because that intentional, malicious, and fully documented betrayal instantly triggered Section 9, Clause D." "Section 9, Clause D," Chloe whispered, her face completely bloodless. "What on earth is that?" "It's a defensive line I prayed to God I would never have to use in my lifetime," I said. I stood directly in front of my son. He was shaken like a leaf. "When I set up this trust, I understood your nature, Julian. I knew you weren't inherently evil, but I also knew your fatal flaws. I knew how easily you could be swayed by outside influences. I knew you were vain, that you would desperately try to appease people like them." I gestured sharply toward the Sterlings, people who measure human worth entirely by a bank statement. "So I had Evelyn build a self-destruct mechanism right into the center of the trust, a safety valve, a poison pill. We call it the wolf in sheep's clothing clause." Eleanor, who had remained quiet since we walked into the office, spoke up for the very first time. Her voice sounded as cold as the Arctic. "Explain it to them." "The clause dictates," I said, locking eyes with my terrified son, using the simplest, most undeniable legal terms, "that if the primary beneficiary, Julian, or any co-conspirators working with him, like his wife and in-laws, are proven to have caused intentional financial, emotional, or physical harm to me or your mother, that beneficiary is immediately, automatically, and permanently stripped of their inheritance. It acts as if your name was never written into this trust to begin with." "Permanently," Eleanor repeated, and those 3 syllables sounded like a heavy death sentence. The exact second you sat in that leather chair at the bank and tried to legally erase my existence, Julian, I said, delivering every single word like a hammer blow, you permanently erased yourself from my will and from my legacy. You get absolutely nothing. No house, no savings, and not a single penny of that $52 million. Not now, and not ever. The words settled over the room like toxic dust. Marcus Sterling was the first to snap out of it, his calculated business brain making one last desperate attempt to find a legal loophole. This is absolute garbage. It's coercion. This contract is a completely unconscionable boilerplate. It will never hold up in a court of law. We will sue you for everything you have. We will fight you to the absolute end. Evelyn Cross actually burst into a loud, dry laugh. It was a cold, mocking sound. Fight us with what, Mr. Sterling? When this trust was originally drafted, it successfully passed 2 rigorous audits by the highest federal tax courts in the nation. It is an airtight, ironclad asset shield. Your brilliant son-in-law legally disqualified himself 4 months ago through his own sheer stupidity. Evelyn held up the stack of documents they had just signed. And to make matters exponentially worse for you, he and every single one of you just executed a notarized, legally binding, comprehensive confession, explicitly admitting to the exact actions required to disinherit him. The game is over, Mr. Sterling. You have completely lost. In that exact split second, the reality of the situation finally washed over Chloe. The house was completely worthless to them. The $52 million fortune, the dream of cementing her status in the upper echelons of high society, the single underlying reason she had ever tolerated this marriage, it was all completely gone. It had never belonged to her. She slowly turned her head to look at Julian, her expression transforming into the look of a viper staring at a repulsive dead rat. "You complete and utter idiot!" she screamed, her spit flying directly into Julian's face. "You ruined absolutely everything." The very next moment, her eyes rolled back into her head, and her body collapsed like a wet rag, sliding ungracefully from the expensive chair and hitting the Persian rug with a heavy thud, completely knocked out cold. Chloe remained crumpled on the floor, barely propping herself up with one elbow. Her expensive white Chanel power suit was covered in dust from the rug, making her look incredibly disheveled. Marcus and Victoria Sterling were pinned to their chairs, their faces turning a ghostly ash-gray color, looking exactly like 2 rigid statues on display in their own museum of arrogance. Julian, my son, was the only person in the room still moving. He just kept shaking his head back and forth, over and over again, as if he could physically rattle the definitive sentence out of his brain. He completely ignored his collapsed wife and his horrified in-laws. He just stared dead at me, his eyes a mix of absolute despair and childlike panic. "No," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "No. If it's not me, then who else could it be?" His voice cracked and distorted under the weight of his unraveling world. "Who gets all that money? Who takes over the house? Who gets to have everything? That money, it can't just disappear into thin air, right?" He looked around the boardroom in a panic, as if that $52 million were a literal mountain of gold stacked in the room, a fortune that had been promised to him, but had just evaporated before his eyes. I didn't offer an answer. I didn't need to. I simply turned my head and gave Evelyn a slight nod. "Evelyn, I believe our other guest has been waiting outside for quite some time. Please, have her come in." Evelyn pressed a small button on the boardroom intercom. "Maya, you can come in now. Use the side door." The heavy mahogany side door leading directly from Evelyn's private office swung open. A young woman walked into the room. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a slightly dusty dark green utility jacket and faded blue jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a practical, no-nonsense ponytail. Her face was strong, kind, and marked by a deep, genuine sense of sorrow. This was my goddaughter and the only child of my late brother, Maya, an elite smoke jumper crew commander who regularly risked her life on the front lines of forest fires out in Oregon. Julian's head snapped toward the door. The moment he recognized her, his confusion instantly curdled into a fresh, raw, blinding rage. "Maya? What the hell are you doing here? This is a strictly confidential family asset meeting. Get the hell out of here. On the floor, Chloe finally scrambled back to her feet. Her hair was a messy disaster, and her pristine makeup was smearing from the fainting spell and cold sweat. She took one look at Maya's rugged clothes, and her face instantly twisted into pure contempt. A firefighter? What is she doing here? Is she here to check the building's fire alarms? Get her out of here right now. Maya stopped a few feet away from the conference table. She looked at Julian, her eyes holding no trace of anger, only a deep, ironclad pity. Hello, Julian. I'm standing here because Uncle Arthur and Aunt Eleanor asked me to be here. She is standing here. Evelyn Cross's voice cut through the tension like an ice pick, because she is now the sole rightful heir to the Pendleton family trust. Julian froze. What heir? As of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, Evelyn delivered the definitive blow. Due to your execution of actions triggering Section 9, Clause D, you have been legally and permanently disinherited. Your status as the primary beneficiary has been automatically revoked. Per the supreme bylaws of the trust, all assets, titles, and property rights instantly and unconditionally roll over to the contingent beneficiary, Ms. Maya Pendleton. Evelyn turned toward Maya, giving her a respectful nod. As of 9 o'clock today, Maya, you are the sole legal owner of this $52 million empire. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. Chloe let out a faint, strangled gasp from the floor, while Marcus Sterling clutched his chest, looking as though he were on the verge of a massive panic attack. Julian just kept shaking his head, a wild, fractured laugh slipping from his lips. Her? You gave absolutely everything to her. A firefighter who spends her life cutting down trees and digging dirt in the middle of the Oregon wilderness. This is a joke. This is the most disgusting, ridiculous joke I have ever heard in my entire life. It's not a joke, Julian, Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a grounded authority that instantly commanded the room. She stepped forward and gently set a crisp, brand-new legal document flat on the table directly in front of Julian. The paper landed with a soft, dull thud that carried a heavy sense of finality. What is this? Julian asked hoarsely, staring at the paper as if it were coated in deadly poison, completely terrified to touch it. As the current legal administrator of the trust, Maya said evenly, and as you were just informed, the trust is the sole legal owner of the estate in Queen Anne. This document is a formal, legally enforceable eviction notice. Chloe scrambled backward, her white Chanel suit looking wrinkled and incredibly pathetic. Eviction? You? What right do you have to evict us? That's our house. No, Chloe, Maya said, looking her dead in the eye for the first time, her gaze sharp as flint. It is my house now. More accurately, it belongs to the trust I am managing on behalf of my uncle and aunt. You and Julian were merely tenants living inside it, and last night you attempted to forcibly evict the legal residents and banish them to a garage attic. Because of that, your tenancy is officially terminated. She tapped her finger firmly on the document. This formal notice grants you and your husband, Julian Pendleton, exactly 24 hours to completely clear out and vacate the premises. 24 hours? Julian finally found his voice, exploding into pure hysteria. Are you out of your mind? All of our belongings are there. Our imported furniture, our entire life is in that house. You have exactly 24 hours to remove your personal, movable property, Maya repeated, her voice solid as iron. After 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, anything left on that property, including your wife's blueprints for a luxury rental and your father-in-law's measuring tools, will be legally classified as abandoned property. I will personally have it hauled away and liquidated, and every single dollar will be donated to senior protection charities here in Seattle. At 2:01 tomorrow afternoon, every single lock on the main house and the carriage house will be changed. You absolute bitch! Chloe shrieked like a maniac, throwing her hands out and trying to physically lunge across the massive conference table at Maya. I highly advise against that, Mrs. Pendleton, Evelyn said, completely unfazed. Without even blinking, she smoothly stepped directly into Chloe's path, cutting off her advance. You and your family are already facing potential criminal exposure for conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable adult. Adding assault to your legal record would be, pardon my unprofessional terminology, incredibly foolish. Chloe skidded to a dead halt, her hands frozen midair, her face contorted into an incredibly ugly, completely powerless rage. From this exact second forward, Maya continued, your presence in this office is considered trespassing, and if any of you step foot onto that Queen Anne property after 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon without express written permission from me, Uncle Arthur, or Aunt Eleanor, I promise you I will have the police escort you away in handcuffs. Julian completely ignored Maya. He ignored everyone. He stumbled past Evelyn, shuffling blindly around the massive mahogany table until he was standing directly in front of me. His face, which had always been handsome and put together, was now a complete mess of tears, sweat, and panic. Her? He choked out, his shaking finger pointing wildly in Maya's direction. You would honestly choose her over me? Her? Why, Dad, I am your son. I have your blood running through my veins. She is just an outsider left behind by your dead brother. I looked at my son. My heart felt incredibly heavy. It wasn't from anger, but from a vast, hollow sense of sorrow. You're right, Julian, I said softly. You carry my blood. But she... I turned around, pointing directly at Maya, who was now standing right beside Eleanor, holding her hand tightly. She is my family. She is the one who video calls Eleanor every single Sunday just to talk about her week. She is the one who, on my birthday, doesn't just send a generic text message, but mails a card she drew with her own hands. 2 years ago, when Eleanor had her knee replacement surgery, she spent her own money to fly out here and slept in a chair by that hospital bed for 3 days and 3 nights straight, never leaving her side and never asking us for a single dime in return. You are my blood, Julian, but she is my family. I looked directly into his completely shattered eyes, and you are nothing but an absolute disgrace. Marcus Sterling's old purple-flushed face finally registered the reality that they had completely lost. He was a man who absolutely hated losing, and he had just been completely checkmated in front of his entire family. He grabbed his wife Victoria's arm, violently pulling her up from her chair. This is an absolute farce, he spat, stumbling over his words as he aggressively tugged at his wrinkled suit jacket. A complete and utter joke. We aren't staying in this room for another second to be insulted by some country firefighter and a crazy old man who thinks he's a king. He's right, Victoria chimed in like a frantic hen, furiously brushing non-existent dust off her expensive silk blouse. Let's go. Julian, Chloe, pack your things. We don't need this pathetic charity. We have more than enough money of our own. We don't want a single dime of his damn $50 million. They moved toward the exit in unison. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim control, a clumsy show of bravado, meant to create the illusion that they were actively walking away, rather than being thrown out like garbage. Seeing her parents take such a hard line, Chloe seemed to find a shred of her old confidence. She grabbed Julian by the sleeve. Let's go, Julian. We'll find the best attorneys in town and sue them for everything. We don't need them. Oh, I'm afraid you are profoundly mistaken, Mr. Sterling. Evelyn's voice cut in from behind them, smooth as glass and cold as ice, completely freezing them in their tracks. They went completely rigid, just inches away from the bronze handle of the door. What did you say? Marcus turned around slowly, the muscles in his jaw twitching violently. I said, Evelyn repeated, I'm afraid you need them very badly. Or, to be more precise, you desperately need his money. Please, everyone, return to your seats and sit down. We aren't finished with our presentation just yet. We have absolutely nothing left to discuss, Marcus growled like a cornered animal. On the contrary, Evelyn replied, pressing a button on her remote control. The massive projection screen hidden in the ceiling let out a faint hum as it lowered into view. You all came here today under the guise of being deeply concerned for Arthur and Eleanor's well-being in their twilight years. We merely wanted to get a much deeper understanding of exactly how genuine that concern actually was. The screen flashed to life, displaying a document with bold, massive text. Financial Liabilities Audit Report, Julian and Chloe Pendleton. Julian and Chloe looked as though they had been struck by lightning. What is this? Julian's panic reached a fever pitch, his voice turning shrill. You have no right to do this. This is a complete violation of privacy. It certainly used to be private, Evelyn corrected him ruthlessly, until you attempted to defraud the trust fund, making it trust business. As the trustee, I hold an absolute fiduciary duty to eliminate any substantial threat to the assets. And you, Mr. Pendleton, along with your co-conspirators, have become the single greatest liability. She aimed her red laser pointer, pinning the dot dead center on the screen. You see, we were initially very confused about what exactly pushed you to such an extreme. Why risk criminal exposure by falsifying a medical diagnosis? Why take such a desperate gamble for a piece of property with less than $3 million in collateral? $52 million is incredibly enticing, but your backup plan targeting the house exposed a deeply short-sighted, desperate financial hunger. It hinted at a catastrophic collapse in cash flow. Evelyn clicked the remote. The screen instantly filled with a massive running list of credit card accounts. American Express Centurion, Chase Sapphire, Visa Infinite, 27 different high-limit credit cards in total. The two of you, Evelyn said, looking directly at Julian and Chloe, have been living a magnificent fantasy. Your combined pre-tax income as a rising tech star and a high society heiress is roughly $300,000 a year. That is none of your business, Chloe shrieked, her face completely pale. It is entirely my business now, Evelyn stated, because according to these bank statements from the past 12 months, your combined annual spending exceeded $900,000. Furthermore, she clicked the remote again. The next slide revealed a long string of high-interest online loans, payday bridge loans, and even a rejected application for a secondary mortgage on their Bellevue penthouse, which turned out to be completely worthless. When you add all of this up, Evelyn's voice echoed through the dead silence of the room, your current unsecured, near-default, high-interest debt totals exactly $854,212.90. What? The shriek didn't come from Julian. It came from Chloe. She whipped her head around to look at her husband, her face turning the color of old bone, her eyes filled with a sickening terror. 850,000, she whispered, her lips barely moving. Julian couldn't even bring himself to look at her. He stared blankly at the screen, staring at the cold numbers that represented his absolute destruction. Every single one of his cards had been laid bare under the bright boardroom lights. You told me it was only 200,000, she screamed violently, her voice cracking with pure rage. You told me it was just a bad crypto leverage play. You lied to me. Julian finally turned to face her, his expression completely broken. I was going to fix it. I just needed one big run in the market. I thought... You thought wrong, you idiot! Chloe roared like a madwoman, angry tears streaming down her face. You thought you could steal your father's house to pay off your damn... What the hell are these records anyway? These, Evelyn helpfully explained, clicking to the next slide, are the detailed trading histories from 6 different offshore crypto leverage platforms and underground sports gambling websites. It appears, Mr. Pendleton, that the vast majority of this massive debt wasn't accumulated by buying luxury handbags for your wife. It was accumulated through gambling and high-leverage speculation. You lost nearly $1 million using money you didn't have. Chloe looked as though she were about to throw up. She backed away repeatedly as if Julian were carrying a deadly, contagious disease. Yet Marcus Sterling, the commercial real estate tycoon, suddenly looked miraculously relieved. He saw a lifeline, a perfect excuse to completely distance himself from the disaster. A gambler, he said loudly, using a tone dripping with dramatic disgust. Good heavens, Victoria, can you believe this? This absolute fraud deceived us into letting our daughter marry him. He played us all. Exactly, Victoria caught on instantly, clutching the pearl necklace around her neck. He almost dragged our poor Chloe straight into the abyss with him. That absolute parasite. Ah, but that isn't entirely accurate, is it? Evelyn's voice suddenly turned incredibly soft, yet carried a terrifying undercurrent of danger. Marcus and Victoria froze instantly. What do you mean? Marcus asked defensively. Evelyn pressed the remote. The screen shifted once more. The new title read, The Sterling Family, Comprehensive Financial Investigation of Marcus and Victoria. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria stammered, her fake indignation vanishing into thin air. "You have absolutely no right to dig into our finances. This is completely illegal." "Once again, I have every right," Evelyn said. "The exact moment you signed that fraudulent document, as co-conspirators, you legally became accomplices to this plot. I had to understand why an incredibly wealthy commercial real estate mogul like yourself, Marcus, would risk his entire reputation on such a clumsy, illegal scam for a property worth a few $1,000,000. Unless you were just as cornered and desperate as your son-in-law." The screen filled with brand new charts and deep red data points. "It appears your boutique commercial real estate trust, Mr. Sterling, has had a catastrophic run recently. In fact, due to massive liquidity failures and falsified occupancy rates, the Securities and Exchange Commission has been conducting a highly intensive criminal investigation into your firm for the past 6 months." Marcus Sterling completely stopped breathing. "My team discovered that you have been frantically embezzling funds from your clients' escrow accounts just to cover the disastrous losses from your collapsing properties," Evelyn declared coldly. "You aren't just broke, Marcus. You are deeply insolvent, and an indictment from the FBI will be landing on your desk very shortly." "You absolute monster!" Victoria screamed, spinning around to face her husband and hitting him frantically like a wild street brawler. "You told me business was incredible. You told me you were an investment genius. What right do you have to look down on me?" Marcus snapped, completely pushed over the edge, his face turning a deep purple as he roared back at his wife. "You spent all day bragging about how much money your mother gave you. That was all complete garbage." "Oh, was it?" Evelyn clicked the remote one final time. "As for you, Victoria, your generous financial support for your daughter, like covering the down payment on her Porsche and paying her monthly rent, that money didn't come from your husband's successful business at all. We tracked the capital flows. You have been systematically and covertly draining the retirement accounts of your 88-year-old mother behind her back. An account that, as it happens, is held at the exact private bank we partner with." "You low-life thief!" Marcus roared at his wife. "You have the nerve to look down on me? You fraud!" Everything completely collapsed in that exact microsecond. The room exploded into a toxic wasteland of screams, finger-pointing, and vicious curses. The raw, hideous truth behind their hollow, high society lives shattered right in the middle of Evelyn's pristine boardroom. It was a beautiful sight to behold. Evelyn Cross just stood there, perfectly still, letting them tear each other to shreds and self-destruct for a full consecutive minute. It was a symphony of vanity ending in complete ruin. Then she cleared her throat. "It appears," she said, turning off the projector and letting a heavy, suffocating silence take over the room, "that you aren't a supportive family, looking out for a vulnerable elder at all. You are a fragile house of cards, in the middle of a catastrophic collapse, and every single one of you tried to use Arthur and Eleanor's livelihood as your personal stepping stone. This meeting is over. You can all get out." The heavy silence stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds. Chloe was the one who finally broke the dead quiet. She didn't faint again. Her calculating mind had been racing, running the numbers. Slowly, incredibly slowly, she pushed herself up from the rug. Her face was as pale as paper, and her eyes locked onto my son, Julian, with absolute venom. "You," she whispered. The sugary sweetness and fake elegance were completely stripped away. It was a low, dangerous hiss. "You lying, worthless piece of garbage." Julian was still staring blankly at the empty projection screen that had just vaporized his $52 million fantasy. He flinched at her words. "What, Chloe? I didn't lie to you. I thought—" "You thought?" she screamed, her voice spiking into a piercing, glass-shattering hysteria. "You thought? You swore to me your family was low profile, old Seattle money. You told me your dad was just an eccentric old man living beneath his means. You told me that outdated house was just the tip of a massive financial iceberg. I did it to give you the exact life you demanded," Julian shot back, his desperation finally boiling over into raw fury. I did it to keep up with your social class. Who was the one demanding a brand new Porsche? Who was the one forcing us into a Bellevue penthouse we couldn't actually afford? Who was the one who maxed out 10 grand last week on a luxury handbag without even blinking? Because you promised me we could afford it, she shrieked, stepping right into his face with her fists clenched tight, looking like a feral animal ready to tear him apart. I was the one burning through energy to maintain our status. I was the one actively managing our lifestyle. Managing? Victoria Sterling chimed in, her voice dripping with pure poison as she finally recovered from the shock. You call hiding nearly $1 million in gambling debt and high-interest loans managing? You are a compulsive gambler, Julian. You trapped my daughter into a marriage built on a mountain of fraud. You are a low-life criminal. Oh, I'm the criminal! Julian let out a broken, manic laugh that sounded completely unhinged. Your husband is a corporate fraud who is about to be sent to a federal penitentiary by the SEC, and you? He pointed a shaking finger directly at Victoria. You've been embezzling money from your own mother's retirement fund. Your entire family is a den of thieves, absolute parasites. Marcus Sterling let out a primal, animalistic roar and lunged across a row of chairs. You ungrateful little parasite! I'll end you! Gentlemen, Evelyn Cross didn't raise her voice, but the word cut through the chaos like a whip. She calmly stepped directly between Marcus and Julian. Enough. The room plunged back into a heavy stillness, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of hatred. This office, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with pure disgust as she looked at the four of them, is a top-tier firm for high-level legal affairs. This is my boardroom. I will not tolerate you turning it into a low-class street brawl. As I stated, this meeting is concluded. The trust assets are perfectly secure. The confession has been executed. Now, I strongly suggest you take your toxic family drama and get completely out of my sight. Chloe didn't look at her parents, and she didn't look at Evelyn. She kept her eyes glued to Julian. I could see the final, cold calculations running behind her eyes. This wasn't the anger of a woman who felt betrayed. It was pure mourning. But she wasn't mourning the end of her marriage. She was mourning the permanent loss of $52 million. So this is how it ends, Julian murmured, his voice completely hollow as he read her expression. The entire time, it was always just about the money, wasn't it? Chloe was already busy scooping up her luxury platinum bag, ignoring his existence entirely. 你从来没有爱过我，朱利安的声音稍微大了一点。你爱的只是这个。他还雇了一圈这间基金社花的办公室。你爱的是这个幻想，是那5200万。You never loved me, Julian said, his voice rising slightly. This is what you loved. He gestured vaguely around the lavish penthouse office. You loved the illusion. You loved the $52 million. Chloe finally stopped what she was doing. She spun around to face him. Her expression was completely cold, controlled, and stripped of every single bit of fake affection. Well, since you're laying it all out there, let's be perfectly blunt. Your father is incredibly wealthy, she said in a flat, deadpan voice. But you're too incredibly stupid to even figure out how to inherit it. You had one job, Julian, and you completely botched it, didn't you? Those words landed like an armor-piercing bullet. I watched my son take the hit. I watched the weak, desperate boy who had spent years destroying his own life just to appease this woman finally die inside of him. He stood up perfectly straight. He looked at her. It felt like the very first time in his entire life he was actually seeing this woman for exactly who she was. You are a monster, he said quietly. Chloe let out a sharp, grating chuckle completely devoid of humor. No, Julian, I am just a highly practical realist. And you? As it turns out, you are a completely toxic, depreciating asset. She turned back toward her parents. Let's go. I need a stiff drink, and I need to get my divorce attorney on the line immediately. Wait, Julian called out. She turned her head back, her expression filled with absolute impatience. What now? Are you going to get down on your knees and beg me to stay? Save your breath. It's not going to work. Julian slowly, deliberately raised his left hand. You forgot something. With a heavy pull, he slid a simple, solid gold band off his ring finger. It was my father's wedding ring, the one I passed down to Julian the day he told me he was getting married. He looked at the ring for a brief second, then threw it hard against the polished floor. The gold band bounced and clattered across the mahogany, sliding all the way over until it stopped right next to Chloe's designer heels. "I am divorcing you," he said, pronouncing every single syllable clearly. Chloe looked down at the ring, then back up at him. She burst into that same shrill, unhinged laugh. "You're divorcing me? You complete idiot. You can't even afford the retainer fee for a basic divorce lawyer. I'm going to take every single thing you—" She froze mid-sentence. A terrifying, definitive realization suddenly hit her like a physical blow. You don't have a single thing left for me to take." "Exactly," I chimed in from my chair, delivering the final blow. Chloe's entire face collapsed. The very last shred of her sanity and high society composure shattered into pure hysterical rage. She violently yanked a massive, glittering Cartier diamond ring off her own finger, the one Julian had bought her using a fraudulent, high-interest loan. "Fine," she shrieked. "You want it? Take it back." She didn't just drop it. She hurled the diamond ring directly at Julian's face like a weapon. Julian instinctively ducked, and the expensive ring, worth a down payment on a luxury home, slammed heavily against the reinforced glass wall behind him with a sharp, echoing crack before bouncing onto the floor. "I would rather move back home and live with my criminal parents," she spat viciously, "than spend one more miserable second breathing the same air in the same room as a penniless, pathetic loser like you." She grabbed Victoria's arm roughly. "Let's go. I'm getting a lawyer to file for an immediate annulment." Victoria looked as though she had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, letting her daughter drag her out of the boardroom like a defeated hen. Marcus Sterling was the absolute last to leave. He didn't look at his wife or his daughter. He stopped right at the exit, turned around, and stared dead at me. His eyes were cold, lifeless, and filled with a deep, boiling hatred. "You," he growled under his breath, "you thoroughly enjoyed this, didn't you? You engineered this entire scenario from the very beginning just to completely humiliate us." "No, Marcus," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching an inch. "I didn't engineer a single thing. I was perfectly content living my quiet, private life. You were the one engineering plots. You were the one conspiring to steal. You were all simply blinded by your own immense arrogance. I merely made sure I had a solid emergency exit ready." He stared at me for 10 long seconds, a heavy promise of an endless legal war lingering in the air between us. Then he turned his back, followed his family out of the office, and slammed the heavy bronze door shut behind him. The sharp sound of that lock clicking into place echoed loudly through the sudden, crushing silence. The thick glass doors were fully shut. All the screaming, the cursing, and Marcus's empty threats were instantly vacuumed out of the room, leaving behind an absolute quiet. They were completely gone. The Sterlings had left with their fake wealth and real cruelty, and Chloe had vanished with her poison and ambition. It felt like a ridiculous nightmare that had simply ceased to exist. The only person left behind was Julian. He didn't leave. Frankly, he had absolutely nowhere left to go. He collapsed onto the rug right next to the boardroom doors like a pile of bones, completely broken. A 40-year-old man in a high-end custom suit, burying his face deep into his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. In a matter of 15 minutes, he had lost his wife, his in-laws, the home he tried to steal, and a staggering $52 million fortune. He was completely, entirely, and irreversibly alone. Eleanor let out a long, trembling breath, sinking heavily back into her chair. Maya, my goddaughter, moved silently up behind her, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder to offer comfort. Evelyn Cross showed absolutely no emotion on her face. She walked calmly back to the head of the conference table, picked up the 10-page property transfer and comprehensive guardianship agreement, that fatal self-inflicted confession, and tapped the edges neat against the wood. Then she carefully slid it into an unmarked, highly secure manila envelope. Julian still hadn't moved. He remained kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, his shoulders shaking violently with deep, choking sobs. It was the sound of a child who had finally hit a dead end, realizing they had caused a catastrophic disaster that could never be undone. I waited to feel something, pity, anger, or any emotion at all, but I just felt empty. Looking at the boy I had raised with my own hands, the man who had completely failed to build an honorable life, I only felt a vast, aching sense of sorrow. I let him cry for a full, uninterrupted minute. It felt like an eternity. He needed to sit there and truly feel the absolute depth of the grave he had dug for himself. Finally, Evelyn cleared her throat. Mr. Pendleton, hearing that incredibly formal title made Julian flinch. He slowly and painfully pushed himself up from the rug. He was an absolute mess. His face was flushed and swollen, and the lapel of his high-end suit was stained with tears. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic panic. "Please," Julian rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. Just let me go. I'll leave right now. I'll stay at some cheap motel. I promise I will never bother you guys again. I have absolutely nothing left. It's all over." Evelyn looked down at him, her face completely expressionless. "You are under a massive misunderstanding, Mr. Pendleton. You still possess a great deal of things." Julian blinked, completely lost. "Like what?" "You possess a massive amount of criminal liability," Evelyn declared coldly. Julian's head snapped up. "What? What? What are you talking about? Isn't this over? This is just a family dispute, a fight over an estate. You won. You took absolutely everything. This was never a meeting about asset distribution, Julian." Evelyn's voice dropped 10 degrees, instantly shifting into a ruthless prosecutor mode. "This was a final summation to lock down your criminal evidence. You seem to be under the naive illusion that once you walk out those doors, everything is settled. It's not. The destination of this case is the defendant's dock at the Seattle Superior Court." "Evidence? Evidence for what?" Evelyn pulled a crisp yellow legal pad from her expensive briefcase and clicked her pen. "Let's list them out, shall we? Item number 1. She scrawled a line on the paper. "Felony fraud and conspiracy targeting a vulnerable adult. You, your wife, and your in-laws conspired to strip your parents of control over their legal property by fabricating false accusations of mental decline." She held up the manila folder she had just packed away. "Regarding this charge, all of you just very cooperatively left a perfect, written confession in front of witnesses." Julian began to shake, a visible tremor rippling from his fingertips through his entire body. "No, we just thought—" "Item number 2, Evelyn continued, completely ignoring his stuttering defense, her pen moving across the pad. "Attempted bank and wire fraud, which is a federal felony. 4 months ago, you and Marcus Sterling personally submitted a petition to Morgan Stanley Private Banking, attempting to illegally seize control of the Pendleton Trust using falsified medical reports. The bank's security system has incredibly high-definition footage of the meeting, and that bank director will make a perfect witness for the prosecution." I was genuinely just worried about his health at the time," Julian wailed. "Item number 3, Evelyn went on, completely deaf to his cries. "Forgery. Attempting to access bank funds using what you falsely claimed was your father's authorization. And finally, the one I am personally looking forward to the most." Evelyn stopped writing and looked up, her gaze sharp as a razor. "First-degree felony abuse of a vulnerable adult. For raw economic gain, you premeditated and systematically inflicted severe emotional distress and mental cruelty upon your parents, both of whom are over 65. In the state of Washington, a conviction on this charge carries a mandatory minimum prison sentence." The word prison hung in the air like a heavy guillotine. Julian's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He stopped crying. He looked like he was about to lose whatever was left in his stomach. "Prison?" he whispered, his voice completely cracked. You're telling me I'm going to prison?" "I'm not just talking about jail, Julian. I'm talking about state prison," Evelyn said, her voice freezing cold. "White-collar financial criminals like Marcus Sterling might get segregated housing, but a degenerate who loses $1 million at the gambling tables and turns around to systematically defraud his elderly parents out of pure desperation, A judge will show absolutely no mercy to a piece of garbage like you. Julian's legs buckled and he stumbled back, collapsing into the nearest chair. He couldn't bring himself to look at Evelyn. He couldn't look at Eleanor. Slowly he turned his head, staring dead at me with eyes stretched to their absolute limit by pure terror and desperate pleading. "Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Dad, please. You can't do this to me." He suddenly rolled right out of the chair, scrambling across the floor on his hands and knees until he was at my feet, grabbing the fabric of my Armani suit trousers. "Dad, I'm begging you. You can't put your own flesh and blood in prison. You're not capable of that. It was Chloe. It was her parents. They were the ones who pushed those disgusting ideas into my head. They told me this is how old money families operate." I was backed into a corner and had nowhere else to turn. I love you, Dad. I've always loved you. Please don't ruin my life." I looked down at the 40-year-old man kneeling at my feet, weeping like an infant. "You love me." I repeated the words, and they tasted like crushed glass in my mouth. "You attempted to silence me, to lock me away in some dark corner, and let everyone forget I ever existed, Julian. Is that what you call love? You stood in the house I built with my own hands, in my personal study, and told me in that condescending tone that I should willingly cast myself out into the freezing cold and fade away. I didn't mean it that way," he sobbed hysterically. "I was just terrified. You were greedy," I exposed him ruthlessly. "And right now you just look incredibly pathetic. You ask me if a father could find it in his heart to send his son to prison? Then let me ask you, could a good son find it in his heart to lock his father in an asylum? You already know the answer. You hand-delivered that answer to me last night." I looked up at Evelyn. "Evelyn, legally speaking, does he have any other choice?" Hearing that question, Julian snapped his head up, a manic, desperate spark of hope exploding across his tear-stained face. "He does," Evelyn replied. "As I outlined to you before the meeting, Mr. Pendleton, your father is willing to extend a conditional mercy. He is willing to authorize my firm to suppress this evidence instead of turning it over to the district attorney's office." "Any condition!" Julian screamed from the floor, his voice cracking from the strain. "I'll agree to absolutely anything, Dad. I swear, name it." "It is a highly restrictive, non-negotiable package of terms," Evelyn warned. "These terms are final. There will be no counter-offers. Do you understand?" Julian nodded his head frantically like a madman. "Yes. Just tell me what it is. I'll sign it right now." "First," Evelyn said methodically, "you must immediately sign a comprehensive, detailed confession outlining all of your illegal activities. My team has already drafted it, based on the documents you executed earlier. Second, you must immediately execute the divorce papers we are preparing. You will file on the grounds of irreconcilable differences and completely waive any current or future claim to Chloe's assets or marital property. Third, you will sign a permanent restraining order against Chloe Sterling and her parents, prohibiting them from coming within 500 feet of you. We are legally cutting all ties between you and that toxic family to ensure you are never manipulated by them again." "I'll sign it! I'll sign everything!" Julian agreed frantically, desperate to grab the only lifeline he had left. "Is that it? I'll sign it this exact second." "Fourth," Evelyn's voice suddenly dropped, turning incredibly heavy. "This is the core condition. It is the specific penalty your father personally designed for you." Julian remained on his knees, looking up at Evelyn, waiting for the final sentence. He looked like a cornered animal ready to accept any lashing just to survive. But right as Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, Eleanor raised her hand. "Wait, Evelyn, just give us a moment." Ever since she had repeated the word permanently earlier, she had been sitting there like a ghost, silently absorbing every single sickening truth. Now she stood up from her chair. She walked past me, past Maya, and stopped right in front of her son. I expected to see her usual softness. I expected her to pull him into her arms and weep. But her face was as hard as granite. It was the face of a mother whose fundamental reality had been completely demolished. "Before we discuss the final terms," her voice trembled, but it was incredibly clear, "I only need to know one thing." Julian looked up at her, his face a complete disaster. "Mom, ask me anything at all." Why, she asked. It was the simplest question in the world, and yet the most complex. Why did you do it, Julian? Did we not love you with every single shred of our beings? We gave you every single thing we had to give. We worked like absolute draft horses. Your father built a financial empire with his own sweat, and to protect you from the poison of wealth, he chose to keep it a secret and live in poverty. And you? You attempted to destroy him physically and mentally. You looked at us, your own parents, and you didn't see family. You saw an obstacle, a pile of garbage that needed to be cleared away. What did we do wrong? What did I do wrong to make you hate us this much? That question was exponentially more destructive than any felony charge. It was a mother in pure despair, demanding to know how the child she carried for 9 months could transform into an ungrateful monster who would turn on his own family. Julian couldn't form an answer. He completely fell apart, his desperate, broken wails echoing sharply throughout the grand penthouse office. "I don't hate you!" He squeezed the cracked words from deep in his throat. "I have never hated you. I... I was just..." "You were just what?" Eleanor pressed ruthlessly. "What on earth could possibly be more important to you than our lives?" He raised his head, and the ugly, pathetic, ultimate truth finally poured out of him like a dam breaking. "I was ashamed," he roared at the top of his lungs, the sheer force of it nearly tearing his vocal cords. "I have always, always been deeply ashamed." I frowned. Ashamed? What on earth did you have to be ashamed of? We gave you a warm, supportive home, and we paid for you to go to an Ivy League university. "You don't understand at all," he screamed back, staring dead at me. "You will never understand. I grew up in that outdated, modest old house. I went to Stanford, and every single person around me came from actual high society dynasties. You're an elite engineer, Dad, but you drove a 10-year-old Honda and spent your weekends climbing onto the roof to patch your own leaks. Mom, you're a housewife, but you spent your days clipping supermarket coupons just to buy basic groceries. You called that living humbly and respecting hard work?" He burst into that same fractured, tragic laugh. "Do you have any idea what my classmates at Stanford called you behind your back? They called you cheap. They called you bottom-tier middle class. So you were ashamed of us," I said. It wasn't a question. He completely ignored me, continuing to drown in his own catastrophic unraveling. Then I met Chloe, and I got to know the Sterlings. They had those things. They didn't just have money, they had that actual high society sense of class. They casually discussed spending summers in the Hamptons, skiing in Gstaad, and going to elite private clubs I hadn't even heard of. They were just so much more advanced than we were. "They are a den of lying corporate frauds," Maya interrupted, unable to listen to any more of it, her voice filled with sharp disapproval. "How could I have possibly known that back then?" Julian roared at her. "All I knew was that they possessed every single bit of luxury and status I desperately hungered for. I wanted to belong with them. I wanted Chloe. And to get her, I had to lie. I told her you were secretly low-profile, old Seattle money. I lied and told her you only pretended to be broke because you were eccentric, but that you were actually wealthy beyond imagination." He looked at me, a highly bitter irony flashing across his face. "And the ultimate joke is that I wasn't even damn well lying, was I? You actually are wealthy beyond imagination. You just preferred to carry that secret to your grave rather than share it with me." The lie just kept rolling and growing like a snowball, he continued, his voice dropping into a low, vacant murmur. "I had to buy her that Cartier diamond ring. I took out high-interest online loans. I had to take her to luxury island resorts we couldn't actually afford. I borrowed more money. Then I had to maintain that fake lifestyle. The Bellevue penthouse, the Porsche, the top-tier French dinners, and then the crypto leverage. I thought I could win one massive hand, just one big market run to fix it all. I thought I could pay off everything I owed and finally live the life I had been faking." "But you never won," I said. "I never won," he admitted, his voice barely a breath. "I just kept losing and losing and losing. So when your mountain of lies was about to collapse, you turned your weapon on us," Eleanor said, her face completely empty. "When your credit limits completely maxed out, you decided to bleed us dry. Julian slumped forward, completely crushed by the absolute weight of his failure, and nodded his head. Chloe's parents were coming to Seattle. They demanded to tour your priceless historic estate. They insisted on meeting my eccentric, low-profile, multimillionaire parents. I was backed completely into a corner. I knew the exact second they saw that house, the exact second they interacted with you, the illusion I spent years building would instantly shatter. They would see you for exactly who you appeared to be. Average, ordinary. And that was something you absolutely could not tolerate. I finished the sentence for him. Yes, I couldn't. So the plot to legally declare me incompetent? Whose idea was it? I pressed further. It was Marcus's idea, he said, frantically grabbing at the excuse to shift blame. He told me it was a standard asset protection maneuver used by ultra-high net worth dynasties to prevent mentally unstable elders from making catastrophic financial decisions. I just went along with it. I thought that if I could legally control the capital, I could patch up all my debts before you ever noticed, and no one would ever have to know. And when that plan failed, I continued the interrogation. Plan B last night, trying to banish us to the garage attic, what was the ultimate goal there? He couldn't look at me, staring dead at the pattern on the rug. Speak. We were out of options, he muttered. Chloe and her parents said we had to take aggressive action to claim the dominant position. They said you were stubborn obstacles. They said if we just moved in, acted like the rightful owners, and showed you that we were making the calls now, you would just accept reality. Accept reality? Eleanor repeated the words in horror. You wanted to completely crush our spirits? We planned to borrow against the house or just sell it outright, he confessed, fully giving up all resistance. We were going to use the equity to pay off the high-interest loans and the margin calls from the trading accounts, and then we were going to place you and Mom into a high-end, a highly exclusive assisted living facility. We thought you'd be happier surrounded by people your own age. An institution? My voice trembled. You planned to throw us away into an institution like garbage and sell the home I built with my own hands just to pay off your gambling debts? He stammered. You were ashamed of us, Julian, I said, the final freezing reality settling over us completely. You were deeply ashamed of our quiet, honest life. So you decided to steal it, dismantle it for cash, and sweep us out of the house like industrial waste. And you did all of this simply to appease a den of corporate frauds and thieves. He had absolutely nothing left to say. He just knelt there, every single ugly, pathetic truth behind his character, fully exposed in this room. He was a weak man, a gambler, a lying coward, a son driven by vanity and shame to attempt the total destruction of his own parents. Julian's confession hung heavily in the air, thick and suffocating. He remained kneeling on the floor, a 40-year-old man who had just openly admitted that simply because he was embarrassed by his parents' ordinary lifestyle, he had almost buried everyone's lives. Eleanor, who had been completely rigid with profound grief, slowly raised her right hand. I saw exactly what was coming, but I didn't step in to stop it. Crack! The sharp sound of her hand striking his cheek echoed loudly against the high ceilings of the boardroom. It wasn't a gentle reprimand. It was a heavy, furious slap that knocked Julian's head completely to the side. That, Eleanor's voice trembled with a profound, white-hot fury I had never witnessed from her in 48 years of marriage, is for every single tear you made me cry. And that is for the absolute terror you brought into our home. That is for standing in the sunroom I personally tended, plotting how to cram your father and me into a garage attic that doesn't even have heat. Julian didn't even try to flinch away. He sat perfectly still like a statue, letting the deep red handprint form on his cheek. I assumed that was the end of it. I assumed that was Eleanor's final sentence. But what she did next completely shattered the cold defense I had been forcing myself to maintain. She let out a piercing, violently shaking sob, her knees buckling as she dropped straight onto the rug right in front of him. She lunged forward, violently pulling his head down into her chest, locking her arms around him exactly the way she used to hold him when he was an infant, and wept uncontrollably. And this hug, she wailed, her tears pouring onto Julian's hair like rain. is because you are still my son. You are my own flesh and blood. You are an idiot, an absolute hopeless idiot, but you are still my son. The final defensive wall Julian had built to protect his pride was completely pulverized in that exact microsecond. He let out a loud howl like a wounded animal, a sound of raw, bottomless despair. He gripped his mother tightly, burying his face deep into her shoulder. In the middle of that empty corporate penthouse, two broken souls clung to each other, weeping over the total destruction of the family he had ruined. Maya turned her back to them, walking over to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows to give them privacy. Evelyn looked at me, her usually unreadable face completely blank, but her eyes asked the question, "What do we do now, Arthur?" I let them cry for a full consecutive minute. I let the poison drain out of them with their tears. But this was absolutely not the destination. This was merely the beginning of a harsh reckoning. I took a step forward, walking over to them. "Eleanor," I spoke up, my voice firm but no longer icy. "Enough!" I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. She raised her head to look at me, her face completely covered in tears. "Evelyn Maya," I said, "please give us a few moments of privacy. Just my wife, my son, and me." Evelyn offered a nod. She and Maya swiftly and silently walked out of the boardroom, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind them, leaving the three of us completely alone inside. I looked down at Julian, who was still kneeling on the floor, and Eleanor sitting right beside him. "Stand up, Julian," I commanded, reclaiming my absolute authority. He let out a ragged sniffle, using the sleeve of his expensive custom suit to messily wipe his face. He looked exactly like a schoolboy caught doing something wrong, waiting for his punishment. "Dad, Stand up." He pushed himself up slowly, every movement heavy and agonizing, until he was standing directly in front of me. His head hung low and his shoulders slouched, looking as though every bone had been drained right out of his body. "You have exactly two options," I said, my voice cutting like winter ice. "So I want you to listen to me incredibly carefully and hear every single word. Evelyn and I have already put together an airtight sealed file. It is packed with your bank records, the testimony of the private banking director, and documented evidence of your actions from last night, including that comprehensive confession you and those frauds just executed. It is more than enough to put you, Chloe, and her parents behind state or federal bars for a very long time. That is Plan A. If you choose that path, from this moment on, you and I and you and your mother are completely dead to each other." Julian's eyes snapped open in sheer terror. "Dad, no! You said there were conditions." "I did," I countered coldly. "That is Plan B. You can stay out of prison, Julian. You won't face criminal charges from me, but you are going to pay for what you did. You are going to learn exactly what you owe this family in a way you will never forget. And these terms are absolute. There is no negotiating. You agree to all of them right here, right now, or I call Evelyn back into this room and have her courier that file directly to the district attorney's office. Do you understand?" "Yes. Yes, Dad." He nodded frantically, his eyes wild with desperate panic. "Any condition, anything to stay out of prison, I'll do it." "Excellent." I began to pace slowly around the room. "First, you will check yourself into an inpatient gambling rehabilitation facility immediately. I am not talking about a weekly counseling session. I mean a lockdown, mandatory treatment center. You are a compulsive gambler and speculator, Julian. You are addicted. You will complete a 40-day lockdown program, and once you are out, you will attend every single support group they assign until the doctors declare you fully recovered. Understood?" "Yes, Dad." "Second, you are going to get a job. I don't care what it is. You can wash dishes, flip burgers, or drive a truck. You are going to use your own hands to earn a physical blue-collar paycheck. And you will use that paycheck to pay back every single cent of the $854,212 you owe. Not to me, but to the trust fund with interest. You will not receive a single dime of charity from me, your mother, or the trust ever again. Your inheritance is permanently gone. Understood?" He swallowed hard. The reality of a massive debt he might spend the rest of his life paying off combined with dropping to the lowest tier of manual labor, finally sank in. He looked at me, thought about the alternative behind a prison gate, closed his eyes, and gave a heavy nod. Yes, I understand. I'll do it. Third, you are completely finished with Chloe and the Sterlings. Evelyn is drafting the divorce papers out there right now, and you will sign them today. You will also file a permanent 500-foot restraining order against all three of them. For the rest of your life, you are never to see them, speak to them, or contact them in any capacity. They are toxic, Julian. They fed you poison, and you swallowed it willingly. As of today, that supply is permanently cut off. Understood? This time there was no hesitation. Yes, it's over, I know. Good. I stopped pacing and stood dead in front of him. Fourth, you will accept your final penalty. Julian looked at me, pure dread filling his eyes. A final penalty? He must have been thinking. Manual labor and crushing debt weren't enough. Those are just basic adult responsibilities, son, I said, reading his mind. That is just you cleaning up your own mess. No, the penalty I am talking about is a real consequence, a physical reminder that will force you to remember exactly what you did and who you almost became every single time you open your eyes in the morning. What penalty? He asked, trembling. I let the silence hang over the room for a few seconds. I looked over at Eleanor. Her face was still covered in tear stains, but she gave me a firm nod. She was with me on this. We were a united front. You are moving back home, I declared. A wave of ridiculous, unbelievable relief washed over Julian's face. He looked like he was about to collapse out of pure gratitude. Home? Oh, Dad, thank you. Thank you, I promise. Don't thank me just yet. I cut him off sharply. You aren't moving back as our son. You are moving back as our tenant. Maya is the sole legal owner of that property now, which means she is your landlady. I can pay rent, he said eagerly, with the money from my job. Oh, you'll pay rent, I said without a hint of emotion, but not in cash. You'll pay with your sweat. You are going to live in the carriage house. The expression on his face instantly turned to stone. The carriage house? Yes, that uninsulated garage attic in the backyard. The exact space you and your high society wife so generously handpicked for your mother and me. That will be your home. It's compact, practical, and as you personally pointed out yesterday, a person doesn't really need all that much space anyway. You will live there, and as your rent, you will become the live-in property handyman. You are going to patch the roof when it leaks, Julian. You are going to clear the clogged drains, paint the fences, and push that old lawnmower across the grass. You are going to learn through your own physical labor exactly how much blood and sweat it takes to maintain the home you were in such a frantic rush to steal and sell off. You will do this every single day until your debts are cleared, not just your financial debt to the trust, but your moral debt to this family. Do you accept these terms? He stared at me blankly. The sheer velocity of his drop from grace had completely crushed him. In less than 24 hours, he had gone from an arrogant, high-earning corporate vice president with a guaranteed $52 million inheritance to a divorced, bankrupt gambler, sentenced to live in a drafty garage attic, fixing his parents' plumbing. It was exactly what I intended. It was a daily grinding discipline far more profound than sending him away to a prison cell. It was pure justice. He looked at his mother. He looked at me. Then slowly and with total defeat, he nodded. Yes, Dad, he whispered, I accept. 6 months later, the historic century-old home in Queen Anne felt completely different. The air felt lighter. The suffocating weight of pretense and anxiety that had choked our family for years had entirely evaporated. In its place was something I had long given up on ever hearing again, the sound of a normal, happy household. Maya and her husband David, a gentle, incredibly grounded high school physics teacher, moved into the 2 guest rooms on the 2nd floor, just 2 weeks after the storm at the Columbia Center. We were thrilled to discover that Maya was actually 6 months pregnant. Amid all the toxic chaos of the family dynamics, she hadn't dared to share the news with anyone. The moment she found out, Eleanor transformed. The hollow, heartbroken mother from Evelyn's office vanished, and the vibrant, loving woman I fell in love with decades ago came rushing back. She channeled all the grief from Julian's betrayal into a fierce, joyful focus, preparing for her new grandniece. The old house, quiet for so many years, now echoed daily with the sound of Eleanor and Maya laughing in the kitchen. They would spend hours debating the perfect shade of non-toxic paint for the nursery and baking together. Good heavens, I couldn't remember the last time I smelled Eleanor's baking. She hadn't baked for pure pleasure in years. Now the house was constantly filled with the scent of cinnamon, vanilla, and fresh apple pies. Eleanor and I moved back into our master bedroom, our sanctuary. Life had found a brand new, beautiful rhythm. Maya and David insisted on covering the daily household expenses, and David turned out to be an incredible gardener, spending his weekends bringing the overgrown backyard back to life. We became a family completely different from what I had initially planned, but one that was entirely real. And then there was Julian. Julian lived in the carriage house above the garage. He had completed his 40-day inpatient rehab program the month prior. He looked significantly thinner. The nauseating arrogance and entitlement that used to define him had been completely stripped away, leaving behind a quiet, reserved middle-aged man with hollow eyes that I barely recognized. He kept his word. He found a job. He was working as a freight associate at a Home Depot a few blocks away, spending his days loading heavy paint buckets and hauling sheets of drywall. Every evening, right around 6:15, I would hear the wooden latch of the backyard gate click open and shut. I would stand behind the kitchen window, silently watching my son, my 40-year-old son, drag his feet across the lawn toward the creaking door of the carriage house. He was no longer the tech executive in the sharply tailored suits. He came home covered in a fine layer of white drywall dust, his hair matted to his forehead with sweat, and grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. He looked exhausted. He looked thoroughly broken. But he finally looked like a real human being. He didn't join us for dinner. That was part of the contract. He had to handle his own meals, eating entirely alone in that cramped, drafty space above the garage. He was a tenant and a handyman. He was serving his sentence. I didn't speak to him, and he never attempted to speak to me. We coexisted on the same piece of land, but we occupied two completely parallel universes. Eleanor would sometimes look at me with pleading eyes, hoping I would say a word, offer some tiny shred of comfort, but I remained unmoved. This wasn't a wound that could be stitched up with a casual apology. It was a debt that had to be paid back cent by cent, through endless sweat, humility, and time. Late one evening, I was alone in the kitchen while Eleanor and Maya were upstairs. I was about to pour myself a glass of water when I heard a familiar sound. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the kitchen sink. The faucet was leaking. It was the old brass faucet I had personally installed 15 years ago. I let out a sigh, watching the steady rhythm of the water droplets. Then I glanced up at the clock on the wall. It was 6:13 in the afternoon. I waited. At exactly 6:15, right on cue, I heard the backyard gate click. Looking through the kitchen window, I saw Julian walking past with his head down and his shoulders slouched, carrying a cheap plastic lunchbox. I dried my hands and walked out to the side garage door leading into the backyard. I pushed it open and walked up the exterior wooden stairs. The carriage house was clean but incredibly sparse. There was a single bed made with absolute precision, a second-hand desk, and a single-burner hot plate sitting in the corner. Julian was standing in the middle of the room, struggling to pull off his heavy, mud-covered work boots. The exact second he saw me standing in the doorway, he completely froze. He looked exactly like a startled wild animal. "Dad," he rasped out. "The faucet," I said, my voice flat and purely business. "The one in the kitchen is leaking. The washer inside must be shot. I need you to fix it." Julian just stared dead at me. For a fleeting second, I caught a brief flash of the old Julian behind his eyes, the corporate vice president who was used to hiring people to make his inconveniences disappear, the elite manager whose hands had never known hard work. I stared right back at him without flinching an inch. That spark vanished entirely. He lowered his head, looking down at his rough, blistered hands. "Okay," he replied in a quiet voice. I'll have to stop by the store tomorrow to match that specific model with a new rubber O-ring." "Fine," I said. "Keep an eye on your time. Maya needs the kitchen to prepare dinner tomorrow afternoon." I turned around to head back down the steps. Halfway down the stairs, I stopped. I didn't look back. "Your mother," I said under the empty air, "made chicken cacciatore tonight, your favorite. She left a plate out on the stove for you." I heard a sharp, sudden gasp come from the room behind me. I stood perfectly still on the stairs. Then came a muffled, choked-up sob. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice incredibly thick. "Please tell her I said thank you." I stood on the stairs for a few moments longer, my hand gripping the freezing wooden handrail tightly. I wasn't anywhere near ready to forgive him, not by a long shot, but I knew exactly what I was witnessing. "You're earning your rent, Julian," I said, still refusing to look back, my voice drifting off into the damp, cold Seattle night air. "You're getting your hands dirty. You're standing on your own 2 feet." I paused for a second. The final word slipped out, carrying the entire weight of everything we had lost, and the massive weight of the wreckage we were still trying to clean up. "For the first time in your entire life, you're actually living your own life." I walked down the remaining steps and pulled the heavy side doors shut, leaving him completely alone in the carriage house with nothing but a pile of cheap tools and the dinner his mother had left out for him. 2 weeks later, the landline in the kitchen rang. It was Evelyn Cross. Her voice was sharp, efficient, and carried the definitive finality of a closed case. "Arthur," she said, "I wanted to give you one final brief on the closure of the Sterling matter. Everything has officially drawn to a permanent conclusion." I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of black coffee. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Eleanor and Maya sitting on the backyard porch swing, laughing hysterically as they discussed the baby. "What happened, Evelyn?" I asked calmly. "Marcus Sterling," Evelyn said, taking her time with the words, "was handcuffed in public by a team of federal agents an hour ago on the 9th green of the Lake Washington Golf Club." I closed my eyes. This was justice. "That SEC investigation we uncovered turned out to be the definitive fatal blow," Evelyn continued. "He wasn't just embezzling funds from his clients' escrow accounts, Arthur. He was running a full-scale Ponzi scheme. The federal prosecutors are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. He will never walk out of a prison cell alive." I pictured that arrogant, demanding man, the corporate tycoon who had sneered in my face, declared I was worthless, and assumed he was taking over my life. He was a piece of garbage who measured human value entirely by numbers in a bank account, and his own numbers turned out to be nothing more than a massive lie built on a mirage. "What about his wife, Victoria?" I asked. "Completely wiped out," Evelyn replied, and I could hear a cold satisfaction in her tone. "Every single account under her name has been frozen by the federal government due to her direct involvement in laundering funds for Marcus's firm. Their estate in Beverly Hills has been seized by federal marshals, and all of their luxury vehicles have been towed away. According to my investigator's latest tracking, she is currently staying at a $40 a night motel. Financially speaking, she is completely dead to society. And the ultimate joke," Evelyn added, "is that she actually had the absolute nerve to call my firm, screaming and demanding the Pendleton Trust cover her criminal defense fees. She actually claimed she was a victim of my aggressive legal tactics." "How did you handle her?" "I sent her a massive bill," Evelyn said coldly, "billing her directly for the severe emotional distress and trauma inflicted upon my clients, Arthur and Eleanor Pendleton. She hasn't called back since. The Sterlings are finished, Arthur. Socially, financially, and legally erased. They flew way too close to the sun, and there isn't even ash left of their legacy." I felt a strange, profound stillness settle over me. It wasn't a feeling of wild victory. It was simply the quiet clarity of a job completely finished. "And the daughter?" I asked, refusing to even bring myself to say her name. "Ah, yes, Chloe. She has been incredibly busy lately," Evelyn said. "How so?" "Exactly as she threatened. She wasted no time filing for divorce in family court," Evelyn explained. Her attorney, a notoriously bloodthirsty divorce lawyer downtown, immediately petitioned the court for an emergency injunction to freeze all hidden assets belonging to Julian to secure a massive punitive alimony settlement. Until the absolute final microsecond, She genuinely believed those millions were hidden away somewhere. She was completely convinced we were just playing an incredibly complex psychological game with her. And the result? I asked, already knowing the answer. Evelyn let out a rare, dry chuckle, completely devoid of warmth. The result was a total disaster for her. We submitted Julian's pay stubs from Home Depot for the past 3 months. We provided a notarized copy of his lease agreement for your backyard garage attic. And we produced his personal bank statements, revealing a grand total account balance of exactly $212.48. The image of Chloe's face when she saw those documents flashed clearly in my mind. Her attorney, Evelyn said with immense pleasure, officially filed a motion to withdraw from the case this morning, citing the client's complete inability to pay for legal services. It appears Chloe can't even afford to retain her own shark anymore. She has no job, absolutely no real-world survival skills, and her parents' unlimited black cards are now just pieces of useless plastic that will get rejected trying to buy a basic cup of coffee. She gets absolutely nothing. So she ends up with nothing. She leaves this family with exactly what she brought into it. Evelyn confirmed. A toxic, empty personality and a closet full of designer clothes that are already out of style. There was a brief pause on the line. Though you don't need to waste a single second feeling sorry for her, Evelyn added. My investigator did one final pass out of pure professional curiosity. She has already sprinted right back into the hunting market. She was spotted last night at a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum, throwing herself entirely at a 90-year-old Texas oil tycoon in a wheelchair. She's already locking down her next target. I shook my head, a slight bitter smile forming on my lips. Some people simply never learn, Evelyn. No, Arthur, she replied. They don't learn. But we do. And Julian is learning. I believe that is the only thing that actually matters. Her words echoed softly through the quiet kitchen. So, Evelyn said, her voice turning a bit softer, all business is concluded. The dust has settled. The sterlings have vaporized. Chloe is permanently out of your world, and Julian is paying his debt. One final question. Are you happy, Arthur? After all this blood and ruin, was it worth it? I didn't offer an immediate answer. My gaze drifted right back out the window. Eleanor and Maya were still sitting on the porch swing, laughing completely from the heart. Out on the lawn, I saw Maya's husband, David, standing right next to our old, notoriously stubborn, riding lawnmower. And standing right beside David was Julian. He was completely covered from head to toe in grease and dirt, his hands black as charcoal. He had the engine hood popped open, and he and David were both leaning deep inside to inspect the machinery. David was pointing at a specific gear inside, explaining something, and Julian was listening with absolute focus, nodding along repeatedly. He was no longer the slick, fast-talking tech vice president. He was no longer the arrogant, completely defeated, ungrateful son. He was just an ordinary man, humbly asking for help on how to fix a machine. He was learning how to do the exact kind of dirty, exhausting work I had spent my entire life doing. I watched Julian finally straighten his back and pull hard on the mower's starter cord. The engine let out a heavy cough, blew out a puff of black smoke, and then miraculously roared back to life with a steady rumble. Julian climbed onto the seat, shifted into gear, and slowly, carefully cut a perfectly straight, clean green path across the grass. I brought my attention back to the phone. Happiness is too fragile a word for this, Evelyn, I said. I'm not happy because I had to watch my own son break into a complete and utter wreck. I'm not happy because I had to tear down his entire life just to save his soul. But, Evelyn guided gently. But, I said, my throat tightening, I look out that window and I see the first genuine smile on my wife's face in years. I see my goddaughter, a girl who has been more of a daughter to me than my own flesh and blood, safely and peacefully carrying a new life under my roof. This house is filled with laughter again. I watch Julian driving that mower, making another perfectly straight cut. I see the sheer focus on his face. I see a man out on that lawn, I summarize slowly. A man who might, just maybe, turn out to be worth something one day. I'm not happy, Evelyn, but I am at peace. For the first time in a very, very long time, I feel actual peace, and I have you to thank for that. That is the only thing I needed to hear, Arthur. Take good care of your family. I will, I said, my real family. I hung up the phone. It had been exactly 6 months since that definitive day of reckoning in Evelyn's office. The long winter had finally passed, and a cool early spring evening had settled over Seattle. Sundays in this historic century-old home in Queen Anne used to be an agonizing display of pure pretense. Eleanor and I would burn through energy trying to keep a fragile peace, while Julian and Chloe answered with arrogance and vanity, all of us choking down our meals over unsaid resentments and lies. But tonight was completely different. 5 place settings were laid out across the long mahogany table. The air in the dining room no longer felt heavy and thick. It was light, clear, and filled with the rich aroma of Eleanor's fresh rosemary roasted chicken and a lemon pound cake Maya had baked from scratch. David was in the middle of telling a hilarious joke about a confused student in his physics class who tried to prove that gravity was a selective phenomenon. Eleanor laughed heartily, a clear, open sound I hadn't heard from her in years. She sat right next to Maya. Maya was 8 months pregnant now, radiating a soft, beautiful maternal glow, and Eleanor hovered over her like she was a priceless treasure, pouring all the maternal love that Julian had rejected straight into this upcoming new life. I'm telling you, Aunt Eleanor, painting the nursery gray is incredibly chic, Maya said, gesturing with her fork. Absolute nonsense, Eleanor shot back, a mischievous spark in her eye. Gray is far too depressing. We need a bright pop of color. Maybe we can paint some bright yellow ducks. It will be adorable. We can't have the baby getting bored, can we? They look so thoroughly happy. My wife, the woman who used to live like a ghost in her own home, had come completely back to life. She had a brand new purpose. She was preparing to be a flawless grandmother in every way that mattered. And at the far end of the long table, sitting in the exact seat Marcus Sterling used to occupy with such overbearing arrogance, was Julian. He was quiet. He kept his head down, silently eating the food on his plate. He had spent the last 6 months living in the carriage house and the last 5 months working as a freight associate at the hardware store. He looked like a completely transformed human being. The vanity and entitlement that used to consume every inch of his character had been completely washed away, leaving behind a silent, hollow-eyed, middle-aged man. His hands told the entire story. They were no longer the pristine, delicate hands that typed on a MacBook or authorized million-dollar marketing budgets. They were rough, his knuckles covered in thick calluses, his nails trimmed short, but still carrying the embedded stains of paint and dirt that no amount of washing could remove. They were the hands of a man who earned his living through raw physical labor. He didn't join us for dinner every night. That was part of the initial contract. He was supposed to handle his own meals. But Sunday family dinners were slowly becoming an unwritten tradition. Maya was the one who insisted on it. He is a part of this family, Uncle Arthur, she had told me privately. He is pouring his sweat into maintaining this property. He deserves to sit at the table with his family on Sundays. Right now, he just sat there quietly, listening. He didn't interrupt, he didn't boast, and he didn't pretend. He just existed. Julian, David said suddenly, shifting the conversation directly toward him. The work you did patching the insulation in the attic the other day was incredible. The temperature in our bedroom went up by at least 10 degrees. Julian looked up, visibly startled, appearing completely unaccustomed to being the center of attention. Oh, that was just basic fiberglass batting. The old insulation had completely compressed over time. I just happened to notice a draft coming through a gap in the north eaves. Whatever the science behind it is, Maya said with a warm smile, it worked beautifully. Thank you. Julian just gave a stiff nod, a slight flush rising along his neck. You're welcome. Then he lowered his head and went right back to his chicken. He was no longer the center of the universe, no longer the arrogant heir to a fortune. He was just the man living in the garage attic, the property handyman. And for the first time in his entire life, it looked like that was finally enough for him. After dinner, Eleanor and Maya began clearing the plates, joking about who got to eat the last slice of cake. David headed upstairs to read. Following my usual routine, I took a glass of tea and walked out onto the front porch. The early spring air was crisp and pure, carrying the rich scent of blooming azaleas from the yard. I sat down in the old rocking chair, the one my father had built with his own hands, and quietly watched the peaceful street below. Queen Anne, Seattle. This place was my sanctuary once again. I heard the screen door behind me give a slight creak. It was Julian. He stood awkwardly by the doorway, his hands shifting uncomfortably inside the pockets of his faded blue jeans. He looked incredibly nervous. "Dad?" he called out in a quiet whisper. "Julian," I said, not bothered to look back, continuing to gently rock the chair. He walked over and stood right in front of me, breaking my view of the street. He looked smaller, not withered or weak, but stripped of all his exaggerated pretense, reduced back down to his actual human scale. Can I bother you for a few minutes?" "I'm listening." He took a deep, heavy breath. He pulled his rough hands slowly out of his pockets. In his right hand, he was tightly gripping 2 standard white business envelopes. The edges of the paper were visibly wrinkled from his grip. "This is the first one," he said, holding out the thicker envelope. This is the rent for the carriage house this month. I'm 2 days late. I'm incredibly sorry. My paycheck didn't clear until this afternoon." I looked at him, and then I looked at the envelope. His rent, according to my strict conditions, was his physical labor and his upkeep of the property. The contents of this envelope were entirely outside the agreement. "What is this?" I asked. "Maya and David. They have a baby coming soon," he stammered, his eyes glued to the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. "The physical labor I do around the house. It only covers the basic maintenance, but they need to buy diapers, a stroller, so many things. This is my entire paycheck from Home Depot for the month. I didn't touch a single dollar of it. It's exactly $2,120 after taxes. Please give it to Maya for me, just as a small gift for the baby." I stared at the envelope. $2,120. The man who used to gamble away $500,000 on a crypto leverage platform without even blinking. The man who maxed out credit cards just to buy a luxury handbag. Right now, he was handing over every single dollar of the hard-earned cash he made hauling drywall and paint buckets for a consecutive month. "Fine," I said, reaching out and taking the envelope, setting it down on the small side table next to me. "I'll pass it along to her." And his voice dropped even lower. He held out the second envelope. This one was incredibly thin. This is truly a meager amount." His voice carried a completely different kind of shame. This wasn't the vain shame of feeling embarrassed by a modest lifestyle. It was the deep, bone-deep guilt of a man who genuinely owed a massive debt and lacked the power to fix it. There is $150 in here. This is every single cent I could possibly save after covering my groceries and my bus fare to get to and from work. But it's the first payment." I narrowed my eyes. The first payment for what? He finally raised his head, meeting my gaze directly. "The first payment to pay back the $854,212, he said, his eyes turning a deep red. "I know it's a drop in the bucket. I know at this rate I might spend the rest of my life working and never even scratch the surface. But it's a beginning. $150. I'll save another $150 next month. And if my supervisor grants me some overtime hours, maybe I can manage a bit more." He just stood there in the cool spring air, completely exposing his humility, holding out that pathetic yet incredibly heavy envelope. I took the thin paper into my hand. $150 against an astronomical debt of nearly $1 million. It was an absolute joke, but at the exact same time, it was the most valuable fortune I had ever received in my entire life. I looked at the envelope, and then I looked up at my son. "You're right." My voice came out slightly hoarse. "It is an incredibly meager amount. At this rate, Julian, you'd need to work without eating or drinking for roughly 600 years just to clear the balance." He flinched slightly at the numbers, but he didn't look away. He didn't offer a single excuse, and he didn't complain about the unfairness of his fate the way he used to. He just stood there like a tree that had finally driven its roots deep into the dirt, standing firm against the harsh reality. "I know, sir," he replied in a low whisper. Slowly, deliberately, I slid the envelope containing the $150 straight into the left breast pocket of my flannel shirt, placing it right over my heart. "All right," I said, gently patting the pocket. "The first payment is logged. It's a very long road ahead." A single tear spilled over his eyelid, running down his rough cheek. He wiped it away aggressively with the back of his calloused hand, looking slightly annoyed with himself. "Yes, sir." He stood there on the porch for a few moments longer, the quiet night wrapping around us. "The kitchen faucet," he said, shifting his weight. "I already went ahead and replaced the rubber O-ring. It's tight as a drum. It definitely won't be leaking anymore." "Good," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Nice work." He nodded firmly, looking as though he had just been handed the highest, most prestigious Medal of Honor a man could ever receive. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, son." He turned around and walked back toward the side door leading to the carriage house. His silhouette was still tired from a hard day's work, but his spine finally looked a little straighter. I sat alone on the front porch for a very long time. The rocking chair made a slow, rhythmic creak against the floorboards. From inside, I could hear the bright, musical laughter of Eleanor and Maya washing dishes together in the kitchen. In the distance, the faint, low hum of downtown Seattle traffic drifted through the neighborhood. The cool, early spring breeze brushed softly against my face. Evelyn had asked me if I was happy. No, I wasn't happy. Happiness is far too superficial a word for what I felt. I had permanently lost the son I used to know. The slick, arrogant, weak tech executive who built his life on a mountain of lies. That version of him was dead and buried, never to return. I was the executioner who had been forced to systematically destroy him in that boardroom. But as I sat there in the vast stillness of the night, resting my palm gently over the thin envelope tucked inside my shirt pocket, I realized that among all the debris and smoking ruins of his life, I had managed to salvage something else entirely. I had found a man who was actively choosing to pay back his debts, a man who finally knew how to roll up his sleeves and fix things that were broken, a man who was learning, in the most grueling and agonizing way possible, how to build a life with his own two hands instead of trying to scam and cheat his way into buying one. I lost the flashy, high society son I always thought I wanted, but I had finally recovered the independent, accountable man I had always hoped he would become. I closed my eyes. The historic old house was completely quiet. This long, exhausting war was finally over. For the first time in my 71 years of life, my entire world had settled perfectly into its proper alignment. I felt a deep, profound peace I had never known before. And that is the real lesson we can all take away from this story. It's a powerful lesson about the insurmountable gap between price and value. Julian and the Sterlings were pathologically obsessed with the price tag on everything: property valuations, luxury vehicle brands, and empty social status. Yet, they were completely blind to true, undeniable value. They mistook a father's humility for weakness and miscalculated his simple lifestyle as poverty. But real wealth has never been about what you can show off to the world. It exists entirely in the strength of character you forge when no one is watching, the lines you refuse to cross when you're backed into a corner, and the absolute tranquility you find in living an honest, grounded life. Respect, loyalty, and basic human dignity are the only ultimate assets that can never be faked, can never be stolen, and can never be thrown away at a gambling table. How do you feel about Julian's journey toward redemption? And who do you think was the true villain of this entire story? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. If this story resonated with you and you want to hear more deeply impactful stories just like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.